Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story to anyone besides my family and a few close friends, because I know how it sounds. But I swear on everything I hold dear that what I saw that afternoon in Glacier National Park was real. It was June 16th, 1982. I remember the date perfectly because it was my sister's birthday and I was on my way to visit her in Vancouver. I had decided to take the scenic route by train through some of the most beautiful wilderness in North America. The kind of journey where you just sit back and take in the views. The train wasn't crowded that day. I had a window seat on the left side facing the wilderness. Most people were in the dining car or napping after lunch. We were traveling through Glacier National Park, near Golden, British Columbia. The scenery was absolutely breathtaking. Towering mountains, crystal clear lakes, and dense forests that seemed to go on forever. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, the train was moving particularly slowly through a curved section of track. I remember checking my watch because I was calculating when we'd arrive at the next station. The sun was bright, not a cloud in the sky, giving perfect visibility across the landscape. I was just staring out the window, half daydreaming, enjoying the view of the dense forest that came right up near the tracks in some places. We were passing an area where the trees thinned out a bit, creating a small clearing about 75 feet from the tracks. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain didn't register what I was looking at. There was a fallen log at the edge of the clearing where the dense forest began again. And sitting on that log was something. Something I couldn't immediately process. It was sitting in profile to me, so I had a clear view of its left side. It appeared to be watching the back of the train, its head turned slightly away from me. What struck me immediately was its sheer size. I'm not prone to exaggeration. I've raised 3 boys and have a son-in-law who stands 6'3", and this thing was significantly taller than him. Even sitting down, I could tell it was enormous, at least 7 feet tall if it stood up. But it wasn't just the height. It was incredibly lean. Not skinny exactly, but proportioned in a way that emphasized its height. It didn't have the bulky, barrel-chested appearance you see in those blurry photos that show up in tabloids. It looked more athletic, I suppose. The most startling thing was that it was covered entirely in short, dark brown fur, like that Borg lining they use in winter coats. Not shaggy or matted like you'd expect from a bear, but uniform, almost like a very short-haired dog. The fur caught the sunlight in a way that made it look almost glossy. Its head is what I remember most vividly. It was remarkably round, not pointed or elongated like an ape's, but almost perfectly round, like a human head, just larger. I didn't notice any ears, though they may have been small or flat against its head. But that roundness, it's burned into my memory. The creature was sitting with its left leg bent at a 90-degree angle, foot flat on the ground, and its right leg extended out in front of it. Its left hand was raised to its face, as if it was eating something, though I couldn't see what. The movements were so deliberate, so human-like. From what I could see of its build and chest, it appeared male. There were no visible breasts or features suggesting it was female. Just this tall, lean, fur-covered male creature sitting there, having what looked like an afternoon snack. I only saw it for maybe 4 or 5 seconds as the train moved along the curve, but time seemed to slow down in that moment. Every detail was crystal clear, like a photograph being burned into my mind. Then the train rounded the bend, trees obscured my view, and it was gone. I remember sitting there, my heart pounding in my chest, hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd just seen. I looked around frantically to see if anyone else had noticed, but the nearest passengers were several rows away and focused on books or sleeping. I wanted to say something, to shout, "Did anyone else see that?" But the words stuck in my throat. Because I knew what I'd seen, and I knew what people would think if I said it out loud. I'd seen a Sasquatch, a real, living, breathing Sasquatch. I spent the rest of the journey in a daze. I kept replaying those few seconds over and over in my mind, analyzing every detail, wondering if there was any other explanation. Could it have been a bear? No, the proportions were all wrong, and it was sitting too much like a person. A man in a suit? Out here in the wilderness, miles from any road or town? And no costume could capture that natural way the fur laid against its body. When I arrived at my sister's house that evening, she immediately knew something was wrong. "Francis, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said as she hugged me. "Not a ghost," I replied, and then it all came tumbling out. I told her everything. The log, the creature, its round head, the way it sat, how tall it must have been. I expected her to laugh or at least look skeptical, but she just listened. When I finished, she poured me a stronger drink than the tea I'd asked for and said, "You know that area is full of Sasquatch stories, right?" I didn't know. I'd heard of Bigfoot, of course. Who hasn't? But I'd always filed those stories away with UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster. Things that made for entertaining TV specials, but weren't real. Over the next few days of my visit, my sister brought home books from the library about Sasquatch sightings in British Columbia. I was shocked at how many reports came from exactly the area I'd been traveling through. Some descriptions matched what I'd seen with eerie similarity, especially the accounts that described the creatures as more lean and human-like than the popular image of a bulky ape-like monster. When I returned home, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I found myself drawing pictures, trying to capture the exact shape of its head, the proportions of its body. I'd tear them up immediately after, feeling foolish, but then start drawing again the next day. My husband thought I was overreacting to seeing a bear. The train was moving, the light was playing tricks, your mind filled in the gaps, he kept saying. Maybe he was right, I told myself. Maybe. But 3 weeks after my trip, I woke up in the middle of the night with such clarity about what I'd seen that I got out of bed, went to my desk, and wrote down every single detail I could remember. The exact time, the weather conditions, the precise way it was sitting, the color and texture of its fur, the roundness of its head, everything. I sealed that letter in an envelope and put it away in my desk drawer. I didn't know what to do with it. Who would believe me? Who could I tell that wouldn't think I was losing my mind? A month later, I saw a small article in the newspaper about a research group investigating Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. They were asking for people to come forward with their experiences. I hesitated for days, that letter burning a hole in my desk drawer. Finally, I made a copy and sent it to them, including my phone number, but asking for discretion. To my surprise, they called within a week. The man on the phone didn't sound like a crackpot or a sensation seeker. He was measured, serious, and most importantly, he didn't question my sanity or my eyesight. "Your description matches several other sightings we've had in that exact area," he told me, "especially the roundness of the head and the lean build. That's not what most people imagine when they think of these creatures." He asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed in person, maybe even return to the area. I declined. I'd told my story, contributed my piece to their research, but I didn't want to become that Sasquatch lady. I had a life, a reputation, grandchildren who didn't need their friends teasing them about their crazy grandmother. Over the years, I've seen TV specials about Sasquatch, read articles, watched as the subject became both more mainstream and more ridiculed. Sometimes I recognize elements from my own sighting in these programs. Sometimes what they describe is completely different from what I saw. I'm 78 now, and I've had a good life. I've seen my children grow up, held my grandchildren, traveled to places I'd only dreamed of as a young woman. I've experienced joy and heartbreak and everything in between. But in all these years, nothing has ever been as unexplainable, as utterly perplexing, as those few seconds on that train in 1982. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, it wasn't a trick of light or a product of an overactive imagination. It was real, it was there, and to this day when I close my eyes, I can still see that round head, that dark brown fur, those deliberate, human-like movements. I don't expect anyone reading this to believe me. I wouldn't believe it either if someone told me this story, but I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, and no amount of scientific explanation or skeptical dismissal will ever convince me otherwise. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me too, through the window of that passing train, if, for just a moment, our eyes met across that divide between what we think we know about the world and what actually exists in it. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep at night, I wonder if it's still out there in those endless forests of British Columbia, sitting on a log, watching trains go by, carrying people who have no idea what's watching them. I don't have proof. I don't have photos or videos or physical evidence. All I have is what I saw, what I remember, and what I know to be true. And that has to be enough. Story 2. Wow, I've never really told anyone about this outside my family. Even after all these years, I still think about it sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. It was July 1983, and I was 10 years old. The memory is so vivid. That hot summer day near our farmhouse just outside Hazelton, British Columbia. There were 4 of us kids playing in the yard that afternoon. Me, my younger brother Tommy, 8, and our cousins Jen, 11, and Mike, 9. They were visiting from Vancouver for 2 weeks that summer. I remember it was around 4 o'clock because we'd just had sandwiches and lemonade that my grandmother had made. The adults were inside, probably taking a break from the heat. My dad was fixing something in the kitchen, I think. Our farmhouse wasn't anything fancy, just a white 2-story place with a big porch that wrapped around the front and one side. The yard was huge, though, with tall grass in patches and my mum's vegetable garden off to one side. Beyond that was a line of bushes and trees that separated our property from the dense forest that seemed to go on forever. We were playing this made-up game with a ball and some sticks we'd set up as goals. Nothing special, just the kind of thing kids do when they're bored in the summer. I remember we were laughing a lot because Tommy kept falling over dramatically whenever someone got near him with the ball. You know how kids are. Everything is funnier when you're outside on a summer day with nowhere to be. The geese were wandering around the yard like they always did. We had about 7 or 8 of them. They were usually calm unless you got too close to them. Then they'd hiss and spread their wings. Our dog, Rex, was with us too, a big German shepherd mix who followed us kids everywhere. He was laying in a patch of shade, panting from the heat, but keeping an eye on us. I remember the moment everything changed. The geese suddenly got quiet, which was weird because they were always making some kind of noise. Then they started acting agitated, clustering together and moving toward the house. Rex's ears perked up, and he stood, staring toward the line of bushes at the edge of our property. At first, I didn't see anything. We all stopped our game and followed Rex's gaze. That's when I noticed movement in the bushes. Something was there, something big. "Look," Tommy whispered, pointing. We all froze. Between 2 large bushes about 50 yards away, there was something, someone. I don't know how else to describe it. It was standing upright like a person, but it wasn't a person. It was huge. I was a tall kid for my age, and this thing was easily twice my height, probably around 7 feet tall. But it wasn't just tall, it was massive, broad, like if you took the biggest football player you'd ever seen and made him half again as big. It was covered in dark hair, not like fur exactly, but more like really thick hair all over its body. The color was hard to make out in the shadows, but it looked dark brown or maybe reddish brown in places. Its face was... I still have trouble describing it. Not quite human, but not like any animal I'd seen either. It had deep-set eyes under a prominent brow, and I swear those eyes were watching us. The weirdest part was how still it stood. It didn't move or make any sound. It just watched us. Not in a threatening way, but with what seemed like curiosity, like it was studying us. Rex started growling, low in his throat, but he didn't bark or charge like he usually would at strangers. Instead, he backed up slowly, still growling, and then suddenly turned and bolted under the porch of the house, which was bizarre behavior for him. He was usually fearless. The geese were totally freaking out by this point, honking and flapping around, heading toward the chicken coop on the far side of the yard. "What is that?" Jen whispered, grabbing my arm. "I don't know," I said. But part of me did know. I'd heard stories. Everyone in Hazelton had. I must have been staring for a full minute before Tommy broke the spell by turning and running toward the house, yelling, "Dad! Dad! There's something in the bushes!" The creature didn't react to Tommy's shouting. It just kept watching us with those dark eyes. My dad came out onto the porch, followed by my grandmother. Dad was wiping his hands on a dish towel, looking annoyed at first. "What are you kids yelling about?" he called out. "There," I pointed, not taking my eyes off the creature, "in the bushes." My dad looked where I was pointing, and I'll never forget how his face changed. The annoyance vanished, replaced by something I'd never seen on my father's face before: shock, maybe even fear. He dropped the dish towel. "Get inside," he said quietly. None of us moved. "Now!" he barked, and that got us moving. We started backing toward the house, not wanting to turn our backs on whatever was watching us. As we reached the porch steps, I heard my grandmother make a sound, not quite a gasp, more like a humph. She was squinting toward the bushes, one hand shading her eyes from the sun. "What is it, Grandma?" Tommy asked, his voice shaking a little. And then she said something that has stuck with me all these years, so casual, so matter-of-fact. "Oh, it's probably a Bigfoot," she said, and then turned and went back into the house like she'd just commented on the weather. My dad stayed on the porch, watching the creature for another minute while ushering us inside. His hand was gripping my shoulder so tight it almost hurt. Once we were all in the house, Dad came in and closed the door firmly behind him. He went straight to the gun cabinet in the living room and took out his hunting rifle. I remember how methodically he checked it, like his hands were working on autopilot while his mind was somewhere else. "Stay away from the windows," he told us, his voice unnaturally calm. My mum came in from the back room, asking what was going on. They went into the kitchen and spoke in hushed tones. All I could hear was my dad saying, "It's just standing there, watching." We kids huddled together in the living room. Jen was crying quietly. Mike kept asking what it was, and Tommy was unusually silent, which wasn't like him at all. I snuck over to the window and peeked out. The creature was still there, in the exact same spot, not moving, just watching our house now. "Dad said not to look," Tommy hissed at me. "I want to see," I whispered back, not moving from the window. After about 20 minutes, I saw the creature finally move. It seemed to lose interest in our house and slowly turned away. Its movements were fluid, not jerky like you'd expect from something so big. It took a few steps toward the forest, then paused and looked back once more, directly at the window where I was standing. I ducked down, my heart pounding. When I gathered the courage to look again, it was gone. Dad kept us inside for the rest of the day. The adults talked in the kitchen in low voices. I caught bits and pieces, my grandmother saying something about "they've always been in these woods," and my dad saying "never this close to the house before." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes watching us. The weird thing was, I wasn't scared exactly, not while it was happening. The creature hadn't made any aggressive moves or threatening gestures. It had just watched us, like it was curious. The next morning, Dad and my uncle went out to look around. They found impressions in the dirt where the creature had stood. Not clear footprints, just depressions in the soft ground. The bushes were disturbed too, branches broken in a way that suggested something large had moved through them. Later that day, my grandmother found me sitting alone on the porch steps. She sat down beside me and was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandfather used to see them sometimes," she finally said, "when he'd go hunting up in the North Woods. They never bothered him, and he never bothered them." "Was it really a Bigfoot, Grandma?" I asked. She shrugged. "That's what some people call them. The native folks around here have their own names. They've been in these mountains longer than any of us." "Why didn't you seem scared?" I asked. She looked at me with those wise old eyes. They're not interested in us usually, just curious sometimes, especially about children. Your laughter probably drew its attention. That was all she ever said about it. My parents never really talked about it either, at least not with us kids. Life just went on. I've thought about that day a lot over the years. It's strange how your perspective changes. As a kid, after the initial shock wore off, I found the whole thing more fascinating than terrifying. There was something almost gentle about the creature, despite its size and strange appearance. It never made any threatening moves. It just watched us play with what seemed like genuine curiosity. A few years ago, I went back to Hazelton to help my parents pack up the old farmhouse after they decided to sell it and move to Victoria. Standing in that yard again, looking at those same bushes and the forest beyond, I felt a strange sense of connection to whatever it was we saw that day. I've read about Sasquatch sightings since then, of course. Some reports describe aggressive behavior or frightening encounters. But that wasn't my experience. Whatever watched us that summer day in 1983 seemed more like a curious neighbor, briefly interested in the strange, laughing creatures on the other side of the property line before continuing on its way. I sometimes wonder if it's still out there, in those deep woods around Hazelton. And I wonder how many other kids it's watched, playing in their yards on summer afternoons, before silently slipping back into the forest that hides so many secrets. What bothers me most isn't the creature itself, but my grandmother's reaction. The casual way she identified it and went back inside, like seeing a Sasquatch, was no more remarkable than spotting a deer or a bear. Did she know something about those woods that she never fully shared with us? Was her generation more familiar with these beings than they ever let on? I'll never know for sure. My grandmother passed away in 1997, taking whatever knowledge she had with her. My parents claim they don't remember much about that day, which I find hard to believe. How do you forget something like that? Sometimes I think they're just uncomfortable talking about it. All I know for certain is what I saw. What we all saw, that hot July afternoon in 1983. Something was watching us from the bushes, something that shouldn't exist according to science and reason, but was undeniably there. Something that made Rex hide and the geese panic, that shocked my father into silence, and that my grandmother dismissed with a casualness I still can't comprehend. I've never been back to those woods since we sold the property. Part of me wants to return, to set up a camera or just wait and watch. But another part of me feels like that would be an invasion of privacy somehow. Those woods belong to the creatures that live there, whether we acknowledge their existence or not. And maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved, existing in that strange space between childhood memory and adult understanding, between fear and wonder. All I know is that on that summer day, something watched us from the bushes. And in some way, I've been watching back ever since. Story 3. I've never really told this story outside of my immediate family. It's been 40 years now, but I still wake up sometimes hearing those sounds in my head. Summer of '83 changed something in me forever. I was 24 that summer, working as an assistant camp leader at the YMCA camp near Gibsons in British Columbia. I loved that job. Being outdoors, teaching kids survival skills, seeing them light up when they caught their first fish or built their first proper campfire. The head counselor, Mike, was in his early 30s and had been running these wilderness programs for years. Great guy, really knew his stuff. That week in July, we had 9 boys with us, all between 11 and 13 years old. Most were from Vancouver, city kids whose parents wanted them to experience nature. We'd planned this 3-day hike up to Tetrahydron Ridge as the highlight of their 2-week camp session. The area was rugged but manageable, challenging enough to give the kids a sense of accomplishment, but not dangerous if you knew what you were doing. And Mike definitely knew what he was doing. The first day started perfectly. Clear skies, temperature in the high 70s, barely any bugs. We'd packed light but sufficient, enough to be safe, but not so much that the kids would struggle with their backpacks. Everyone was in high spirits as we set out from base camp around 8 a.m. By early afternoon, we were making good progress up the trail. The forest was thick in that area, towering Douglas firs and western red cedars that blocked out most of the sky, undergrowth that rustled with small wildlife. The kids were chattering away, pointing out interesting plants and bugs. Normal stuff. It happened around 2 p.m. We'd stopped for a water break on a part of the trail that opened up a bit, giving us a view down the slope through a natural break in the trees. I was helping one of the boys adjust his backpack when Mike suddenly went quiet, mid-sentence. When I looked up, his face had this strange expression. He was staring intently down the hillside. "What is that?" he said, not really asking anyone, just speaking out loud. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. About 200 yards downhill, standing at the edge of a clearing, was a tall black figure, just standing there. My first thought was it was another hiker wearing dark clothes, but something felt off immediately. The proportions weren't right. "Hey, look at that!" One of the boys, Kevin I think, had spotted it too. Within seconds, all 11 of us were staring at this figure. It was hard to make out details at that distance, but what struck me was the height. Using the surrounding trees as reference, this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was completely black or dark brown, and just stood motionless at the forest edge. "Is that a bear?" asked one of the younger boys, Tommy. His voice had a slight quiver. Mike shook his head slowly. "Bears don't stand like that." As we watched, the figure suddenly moved. Not towards us, thankfully, but sideways into the tree line. The way it moved was unsettling, fluid but powerful, covering ground quickly without seeming to hurry. And then it was gone, disappeared into the bush. The silence that followed was heavy. Some of the boys started asking questions all at once. Was it a person? A bear? Should we be scared? Mike put on his counselor voice, calm and reassuring. Probably just a hiker in dark clothes. The distance can play tricks on your eyes. But when he glanced at me, I could tell he didn't believe that. Neither did I. What we'd seen didn't move like a human. We continued hiking, but the mood had shifted. The kids were quieter, sticking closer together. Mike suggested we take a detour to check out the area where we'd seen the figure, not directly approaching it, but circling around to a spot that would give us a better view of that clearing. When we reached the area about 20 minutes later, we found something that made my stomach drop. In a muddy patch near where the figure had been standing were footprints, large footprints. They looked vaguely human-shaped, but were at least 15 inches long and proportionally wide. The stride length between them was massive. "Whoa!" The boys crowded around, suddenly excited rather than scared. "Bigfoot! It's Bigfoot prints!" Mike and I exchanged looks. He knelt down to examine one of the prints more closely without touching it. "Could be a hoax," he said quietly, just to me. But who would come all the way out here to fake footprints? We continued on our hike, planning to reach a camping spot near the summit before dark. As we hiked, I noticed something else odd about the area we were passing through. Several tree branches were broken off along the path, not at human height, but at about 8 or 9 feet up. The breaks looked fresh, the wood still light-colored and unseasoned. By 4 p.m., I could tell Mike was getting concerned about our pace. We weren't going to make it to our planned camping spot before sunset at the rate we were moving. The boys were tired, and honestly, so was I. Something about that sighting had drained us, keeping us on constant alert. "We should find a spot to camp soon," I suggested. Mike nodded, checking his map. "There's a clearing about half a mile ahead near the summit. It's not ideal, more exposed than I'd like, but it'll have to do." When we reached the clearing, it was almost 6 p.m. The sun was still up, but it would be setting within a couple of hours. The spot was a relatively flat area near the summit of Tetrahydron Ridge, with a few scattered trees and rocks. On one side, the forest continued up toward the peak. On the other 3 sides, the terrain sloped downward, covered in dense forest. We set up camp efficiently, 3 small tents for the boys, 1 for Mike and me. We got a fire going and prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated stew that actually tasted pretty good after a day of hiking. The boys seemed to have mostly forgotten about our strange sighting, now excitedly talking about the stars we'd be able to see once night fell. As darkness settled in, we roasted marshmallows and told the usual campfire stories. Nothing too scary, just enough to give them a little thrill. By 10 p.m. the boys were exhausted from the day's hike, and we got them settled into their tents. Mike and I sat by the fire, keeping our voices low. "What do you think that was?" I finally asked. He poked at the fire with a stick. "I don't know. I've been hiking these mountains for 15 years and never seen anything like it." "The proportions were wrong for a human," I said. "The head seemed right for the body size, but there was no neck, you know. And those footprints, yeah." He stared into the flames. "Let's keep this between us for now. No need to freak the kids out more than they already are." We decided to take shifts staying awake. Not something we normally did on these trips, but neither of us felt comfortable both sleeping that night. I took the first watch while Mike got some rest. The night was clear and cold, typical for the mountains even in summer. The stars were incredible, spread across the sky like spilled salt on black velvet. Under different circumstances, I would have enjoyed it. I was about an hour into my watch when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand up, a roar echoing off the mountainsides around us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before or since. Not a bear, not a cougar, not any animal I recognized. It was deep and powerful, but with a quality that seemed almost deliberate, like it was produced without effort or strain. I woke Mike immediately. He bolted upright, instantly alert. "What the—" The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the forest below us, maybe a couple 100 yards down the slope. "Jesus," whispered Mike. "What is that?" One of the boys called out from their tent. "Mr. Mike, what's making that noise?" Before Mike could answer, the sound came again and again. Sometimes it seemed to come from one direction, sometimes another, as if whatever was making it was moving around the base of our little summit clearing. Mike got the boys up and had them gather around the fire, which we built up higher. They were scared, but handling it better than I would have at their age. We told them it was probably just an animal calling to its mate, normal forest sounds that just seemed scarier at night. But we knew better. This went on for hours, these roars coming from the darkness around us, 5-10 minutes apart. Sometimes they sounded like challenges, sometimes almost like calls. Mike and I sat back to back by the fire, scanning the tree line in all directions. We debated whether to try hiking down in the dark, but decided it was too risky with the kids. A twisted ankle or worse on those steep trails could leave us stranded. Around 3 a.m., the sounds finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the roars had been. Then we heard something else. The sound of movement in the undergrowth, branches cracking, vegetation rustling. It seemed to be about 200 meters below our position. We strained our eyes but couldn't see anything in the darkness. None of us slept that night. As the first light of dawn crept over the ridge, We were already breaking camp. The boys were exhausted but eager to get moving. Nobody wanted to stay there any longer than necessary. The hike down was tense but uneventful. We moved quickly, barely stopping for breaks. By early afternoon, we were back at base camp. The other counselors noticed our early return and the state we were in, but Mike just said we'd had a rough night with some wildlife sounds keeping us up. Later, when the boys were occupied with other activities, Mike and I tried to make sense of what had happened. He'd been in those mountains his entire adult life and had never experienced anything like it. We considered reporting it, but weren't sure who to tell or what to say. A tall black figure, and unexplained roars. We'd sound crazy, so we kept it mostly to ourselves. The boys, of course, told everyone they'd encountered Bigfoot, but that was easy for the other adults to dismiss as excited kids with active imaginations. I left that job at the end of the summer. Couldn't bring myself to go back into those mountains again. Mike stayed on for a few more years, but eventually moved to Colorado to work at a different camp. I still think about that night, about what was moving around us in the darkness, about those roars that seemed to fill the entire valley, and I wonder if we'd had better flashlights, if we'd looked harder into the forest below us, what might we have seen looking back? To this day, I can't explain what happened on Tetrahydron Ridge, but I know what I saw, what I heard, and I haven't gone camping since. Story 4. I've never really told this story outside of my immediate circle. Honestly, I've tried forgetting about it for 40 years now, but I keep seeing similar reports online, and I guess it's time I added my experience to the record. This happened back in August 1983, when I was 17. I grew up in a small town near Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, BC. If you're not familiar with the area, it's heavily forested. Dense woods that seem to go on forever once you're just a few miles outside town. Me and my buddies, Mike, Dave, and Trevor, we were just typical bored teenagers looking for stuff to do during summer break. This particular day was hot as hell, must have been in the high 80s, and we decided to head out to this abandoned property about 3 miles from my parents' place. Local kids called it the Old Zoo, though I doubt it was ever an actual zoo, more likely just some kind of small wildlife park or petting zoo that went out of business in the 60s or 70s. All that remained were some crumbling concrete foundations, a couple of rusted cage frames, and this weird little man-made pond that was now just a muddy depression in the ground. The place had been reclaimed by the forest. Trees growing through what used to be enclosures, blackberry bushes covering everything. We liked hanging out there because it was secluded, no adults around to give us grief. That day we'd brought our pellet guns, nothing serious, just those pump-action Crosman rifles that could barely put a dent in a tin can. We'd set up some apples on an old fence post and were taking turns shooting at them. Typical teenage boy stuff, harmless fun, really. After about an hour, I needed to take a leak, so I wandered off maybe 50 yards into the woods for some privacy. The undergrowth was pretty thick, salal bushes, ferns, the usual Pacific Northwest vegetation. It was noticeably cooler under the tree canopy, and the sudden quiet was a relief after listening to my friends hollering and laughing for the past hour. After I finished my business, I didn't head straight back. Something about being alone in the woods felt good. Peaceful, you know. So I just leaned against this massive Douglas fir, enjoying the moment of solitude. That's when I noticed something weird. There was movement in one of the trees about 100 feet away from me. At first, I thought it was just a squirrel or maybe a raccoon. They climb trees all the time, but whatever was moving was way too big for that. My first thought was bear, but that didn't make sense either. Black bears can climb, sure, but they don't usually hang out in trees for no reason, especially not 12 feet up. I froze, not out of fear initially, but just confusion. The thing was partially hidden by branches and leaves, but I could see dark fur or hair. It seemed to be perched on a thick branch, and from what I could tell, It was facing away from me, looking in the direction where my friends were still shooting and making noise. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 20-30 seconds, I just stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, suddenly, the thing turned its head. Not its whole body, just its head, and it turned almost completely around, like an owl might. That's when I saw its face, and my blood ran cold. I've spent decades trying to find the right words to describe what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. The face was flat and dark, with these enormous eyes that caught what little sunlight filtered through the canopy. There was no hair around the eyes, just smooth, dark skin. The eyes themselves weren't animal eyes. They were aware, intelligent, and they were looking right at me. We locked eyes for maybe 2 seconds, but in that moment, I felt something I'd never felt before or since. Like it wasn't just seeing me, but seeing into me. I know how that sounds, but there's no other way to explain it. Then everything happened at once. The creature made this sudden movement, not aggressive, more like it was startled, and lunged sideways. There was a loud crack as a branch broke under its weight, and then it was moving down the tree with impossible speed, not falling, but descending in this controlled way, using its arms and legs like it had done this 1,000 times before. Another branch snapped as it hit the ground. The sound of those breaking branches is what snapped me out of my frozen state. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I ran. I didn't yell, didn't look back, just ran as fast as I could back toward my friends. I could hear something moving through the undergrowth behind me, branches snapping, bushes rustling, but it wasn't coming toward me. Whatever it was moving away, deeper into the forest. I burst back into the clearing where my friends were, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. They immediately started laughing, asking if I'd wiped properly, typical teenage boy crap. But they stopped when they realized I wasn't laughing back. "Dude, what's wrong?" Mike asked. "You look like shit." I struggled to find words. There's something in the woods," I finally managed. They thought I was joking at first, or that I'd seen a bear or cougar. When I tried to explain what I'd actually seen, the skepticism on their faces was obvious. Trevor suggested we go check it out, and Dave immediately agreed, raising his pellet gun like it would do anything against whatever was out there. "No way," I said. "Let's just get out of here." Mike could tell I was genuinely shaken. He was always the level-headed one. "All right, guys, let's pack it up. We've been here long enough anyway." As we gathered our stuff, I kept glancing back at the tree line. The woods suddenly seemed darker, more threatening. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. On the walk back to town, they kept pressing me for details. What exactly had I seen? Was I sure it wasn't just a bear? Could it have been someone messing with me? It was way too big for a bear, I insisted, and its face was totally unbear-like. Bears have snouts. This thing had a flat face. "Like a gorilla?" Dave suggested. "No, not like any animal I've ever seen," I replied, "and it moved wrong, too fluid for something that size." Trevor, always the skeptic, laughed it off. Maybe it was Sasquatch, man. Vancouver Island Bigfoot. At the time, I got annoyed at him for not taking me seriously, but looking back, he wasn't that far off from what I was trying to describe. The thing is, I'd never been into any of that Bigfoot stuff before. Sure, we'd all heard the stories. What Canadian kid hasn't? But I always thought it was just folklore, campfire tales. What I saw that day didn't match the classic Bigfoot description anyway. This wasn't some giant lumbering ape man walking on 2 legs. This was something that seemed perfectly at home in the trees, that moved with a disturbing agility and had those eyes, those unnervingly intelligent eyes. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I kept waking up in cold sweats, convinced something was watching me through my bedroom window. I never told my parents. They would have just thought I was making it up or had watched too many horror movies. My friends eventually stopped bringing it up too, probably thinking I'd exaggerated or imagined the whole thing. About a month later, I worked up the courage to go back to the old zoo site. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. In retrospect, that was incredibly stupid. I brought my dad's Polaroid camera, thinking if I could get a picture, people would have to believe me. The place looked different in September light. The blackberries were ripe, and there were more shadows as the sun was lower in the sky. I spent about an hour wandering around, scanning the trees, looking for any sign of what I'd seen. Nothing. No broken branches, no footprints, no weird hair caught on bark, just the normal, indifferent forest. As I was about to leave, I noticed something odd about one of the old concrete foundations. There were scratch marks on one side, deep grooves in the concrete like something had been digging at it. They looked fresh, the exposed concrete lighter than the weathered surface. Could have been anything. Bears do scratch at things, and there were plenty of other animals in those woods, but something about the pattern, the depth of those grooves. It didn't seem right. I took some photos, but they didn't really show much. Just grey concrete with some vague lines on it. The Polaroids came out too dark anyway. I still have them somewhere, in an old shoebox in my garage. I never went back to that spot again. By the following summer, I'd graduated high school and was working full-time at the lumber mill, saving money for college. Life moved on. I eventually left Nanaimo, moved to Victoria for school, then settled in Calgary, where I've been ever since. For years, I pretty much convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or at least exaggerated it in my memory. Maybe it had just been a bear with some kind of deformity, or maybe the light and shadows had played tricks on my teenage brain. Then about 10 years ago, I stumbled across this online forum where people share strange encounters in the Pacific Northwest. I started reading stories about tree creatures, beings that weren't quite Bigfoot, weren't quite apes, something in between that seemed to prefer staying in the canopy rather than walking on the ground. Some of the descriptions sent chills down my spine: flat faces, large eyes, incredible climbing ability. A few people even mentioned the same feeling I had, that these creatures seemed to be observing humans with a disturbing intelligence. The thing that really got to me was when someone posted about an encounter near Nanaimo in the mid-90s, not far from where my experience occurred. They described coming across an abandoned wildlife park and feeling watched the entire time they were there. They never saw anything directly, but they heard movement in the trees above them. Branches creaking even though there was no wind. I created an account to message that person privately, asking for more details about the location. They never responded, and when I checked back a few weeks later, their account had been deleted and the post removed. That bothers me to this day. Why would someone share a story like that and then just disappear? Were they making it up? Or did something happen after they posted it? I still don't know what I saw that August day in 1983. I don't label it as Bigfoot or Sasquatch or any other cryptid name. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and it was watching us before I accidentally came upon it from behind. The way it moved, the way it looked at me, there was a consciousness there, an awareness that still haunts me. Sometimes when I'm hiking or camping, which isn't often these days, I get this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like something's watching me from the trees. I always look up, scan the branches, then laugh at myself for being paranoid. But part of me is still that terrified 17-year-old running through the woods, hearing branches snap behind him. Part of me knows that whatever I saw that day is still out there, in the deep forests of Vancouver Island, watching and waiting. And the worst part? I think it recognized what I was faster than I recognized what it was. In that brief moment when our eyes met, I wasn't the observer. I was the observed. I wasn't the intelligent being studying a curious animal. I was the curiosity being studied by something intelligent. That's what really keeps me up at night. Story 5. I've never really talked about this before. Not fully. I mean, I've mentioned it to a couple hunting buddies over beers, but they just laugh it off, call me crazy. Say I was seeing things because of the fading light. But I know what I saw that day in Parksville back in '83, and it still gives me the creeps whenever I think about it. It was late in the hunting season, mid-November 1983. The days were getting shorter, and the weather on Vancouver Island had that raw dampness that seeps into your bones. I'd taken a few days off work at the mill to get one last hunt in before the season closed. The wife wasn't happy about it. She always worried when I went hunting alone, but I promised her I'd be extra careful and bring back some venison for the freezer. I'd been hunting these woods since I was a teenager, following my dad around with my first rifle. By '83 I was 37 and knew the area like the back of my hand. There was this spot east of the Island Highway, about 15 minutes from Parksville proper, where I'd had good luck in previous seasons. It had this perfect meadow with forest on all sides. Deer would often come out to graze in the evening. That day started like any other hunting day. I got up before sunrise, had a thermos of coffee and some eggs, then loaded up my Ford pickup with my gear. I had my Remington 700, the one with the walnut stock my father had given me when I turned 21. I was wearing my red and black checkered hunting jacket, heavy canvas pants, and my lucky hunting cap. Nothing fancy, just the usual get-up. I spent most of the morning and early afternoon moving through different spots, but hadn't seen much. Just some old tracks and droppings. By late afternoon, I decided to try that meadow I mentioned. It was surrounded by a fence, nothing tall, just your standard wire fence, with wooden posts about 4 feet high, to keep cattle in during the summer months. But in November, it was empty. I positioned myself at the edge of the meadow with my back against a large cedar tree. I had a good view of the whole clearing and figured I'd wait there until dusk. The light was still good. It was maybe 4:30 or so, with that golden grey quality you get in the late fall when the sun is low but hasn't set yet. I'd been sitting there for maybe an hour, just watching, listening, occasionally sipping from my thermos. The woods were quiet except for the occasional bird call and the wind rustling through the trees. The kind of peaceful quiet, that's why I loved hunting in the first place. Then I heard it. From the forest, on the far side of the meadow, crashing sounds. Not the delicate movement of a deer. This was heavy, like something big moving through the underbrush, breaking branches, not caring about making noise. My first thought was, maybe it was a bear, but the movement pattern didn't seem right. Bears kind of lumber along, but this sounded more deliberate, more purposeful. I raised my rifle, not aiming yet, just getting ready. My heart was beating faster, and I remember feeling that familiar mix of excitement and caution you get when you know you're about to see something, and then it stepped out of the tree line. Even now, almost 40 years later, I can see it clearly in my mind. It emerged from the trees at the far end of the meadow, maybe 100 yards away from me. At first, in that split second, my brain tried to categorize it. Bear, no. Moose, we don't have them on the island. Person, no, too big, too wrong. It was walking upright, like a man. 2 legs, arms hanging at its sides, but it was huge, massive. I remember looking at those fence posts and realizing this thing was at least twice as tall as them. Had to be 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe more. And it was covered in what looked like dark hair or fur, not black exactly, more of a deep dark brown. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't stumbling or awkward like a bear on its hind legs. It was smooth, natural, like that's just how it walked. Long strides, head slightly forward, arms swinging slightly, almost human, but not human at all. I sat there frozen, barely breathing. Part of me was saying, shoot, but a bigger part was screaming, what the hell is that thing? I'd been hunting all my life and had never seen anything like it, not even close. It didn't seem to notice me, or if it did, it didn't care. It just kept walking along the fence line, parallel to it, never breaking stride. I remember noticing how its head occasionally turned, scanning the meadow or looking into the forest behind it, like it was aware, intelligent. I had my rifle halfway to my shoulder, finger near the trigger, but not on it. Something held me back. If I'd been 100% sure it was an animal, I would have taken the shot. But there was this hesitation. This thing was walking like a person, moving like something that could think, and despite all my instincts as a hunter telling me this wasn't a human, there was just enough doubt to keep my finger off that trigger. My hands were sweating despite the cold. I remember the wood of the rifle stock feeling slippery, and I had to readjust my grip. My mouth was completely dry, and I had this metallic taste on my tongue, pure adrenaline. The thing kept walking methodically along the entire length of the field. Must have been a good 200-300 yards from where it emerged to where it was heading. The whole time, I just watched, barely moving, barely breathing. I remember being acutely aware of every sound, the soft thump of its footsteps that I could somehow hear despite the distance, the rustle of grass, the suddenly very loud sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. It never made a sound. No calls, no grunts, nothing, just this silent, purposeful walk across my field of vision. The silence made it worse somehow, more unnatural. As it neared the far end of the meadow, I thought maybe it would turn, maybe it would see me. I remember tightening my grip on the rifle, a cold sweat breaking out on my back despite the November chill. But it never turned. It just reached the edge of the forest at the other end of the meadow and without hesitation disappeared into the trees. The crashing sounds started again, branches breaking, vegetation being pushed aside, and then faded as it moved deeper into the forest. And then silence. Complete silence. Even the birds had stopped chirping. I sat there for I don't know how long. Minutes? An hour? My legs had gone numb from not moving, and I realized I'd been holding my breath on and off. When I finally tried to stand up, my knees nearly buckled, partly from sitting still so long, partly from fear. I debated with myself about what to do next. Part of me, the curious part, wanted to cross the meadow and look for tracks or signs. But a much louder part, the survival instinct, I guess, was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. That part won. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the forest edge where the thing had disappeared, then turned and half walked, half jogged back to my truck. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, rifle ready, expecting to see that dark shape emerging from the trees behind me. The drive home was a blur. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white and checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't even clean my rifle that night, something I always did after a hunting trip. I just locked the doors and poured myself a stiff drink. My wife knew something was wrong the minute I walked in. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. I just mumbled something about not finding any deer and being tired. I couldn't bring myself to tell her, couldn't find the words. What would I even say? "Honey, I think I saw Bigfoot today." She'd have thought I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that. Fluid, upright, for that distance. It wasn't a man in a costume either. No one could fake that size, that movement, that presence. There was something primeval about it, something that triggered a deep, instinctual fear in me. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on anything, kept seeing that figure walking along the fence line whenever I closed my eyes. I debated whether to report it to someone, but who? The local police would think I was nuts or drunk. Game wardens would probably laugh me out of their office. I did end up telling a couple of my hunting buddies a few weeks later. Bob just laughed and said I'd been dipping too deep into the hunting flask. Mike was a bit more receptive, said he'd heard stories from his grandfather about wild men in the woods, but even he had that look in his eyes, the one that says, "I'm humoring you, but I don't believe a word." There have been other reports around Vancouver Island over the years. I've read about them, collected newspaper clippings. Some sound similar to what I saw, but I've never gone public with my story until now. The ridicule isn't worth it. I went back to that meadow the next hunting season, stood in the exact same spot, but I couldn't stay long. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow at the edge of the forest had me jumping. I haven't hunted there since. I still hunt other areas, but something changed in me that day. The woods don't feel the same anymore. There's a watchfulness I didn't feel before, a sense that maybe we're not always the top of the food chain out there, that maybe there are things in the deep forests of British Columbia that we don't understand. I've never seen it again, whatever it was. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or my eyes playing tricks on me after a long day. But then I remember the deliberate way it moved, the clear outline against the evening sky, the absolute certainty I felt in that moment that I was seeing something not normal. I'm 77 now, and I don't get out to the woods much anymore. My hunting days are mostly behind me, but I still think about that fall evening in 1983. Still wonder what exactly I saw walking along that fence line. Still wonder if it's out there, moving through forests that are getting smaller every year, watching, avoiding us. And sometimes, on cold November evenings when the light is fading, I find myself looking out my window toward the tree line behind our house, half expecting to see a tall, dark figure emerge from the shadows, walking upright, like a man, but not a man at all. Story 6. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd let my dog keep following those tracks. It's been almost 40 years now, but I still think about it. Every winter when the first snow falls, my mind goes right back to Delworth Mountain, March 1984. I was 11 years old then, living with my parents in a small house about 2 miles from the base of Delworth. We weren't exactly in Kelowna proper, more like the outskirts where the neighborhoods start to thin out and give way to wilderness. Our place backed up against some undeveloped land that eventually merged with the mountain's lower slopes. That Saturday morning in March, I remember the sky was this perfect clear blue. We'd had about 6 inches of fresh powder the night before, not enough to cancel school the day before, but enough to make everything look brand new. My dad had gone to his shift at the paper mill, and Mom was busy with weekend chores. When I asked if I could take Rex out for a hike, she barely looked up from her cleaning, just told me to be back before dark and to stay on this side of the mountain. Rex was this big mutt, part German shepherd, part who knows what. He was my best friend, basically, smart as hell and protective too. My parents had gotten him from the shelter when I was 8, and we'd been inseparable ever since. I packed a peanut butter sandwich and a thermos of hot chocolate in my backpack, grabbed Rex's leash, though I rarely used it once we got away from the houses, and headed out around 10 a.m. The air had that crisp, clean smell that only comes with fresh snow, and the temperature was maybe in the high 20s, cold enough to keep the snow from getting slushy, but not so cold that you couldn't enjoy being outside. We took our usual route, cutting through the Petersons' empty lot, then following the maintenance access road that ran behind our subdivision. The road wasn't ploughed, but enough people had walked it that morning that there was a decent path. Rex bounded ahead, occasionally diving into the deeper snow at the sides, then shaking himself off and running back to me. After about half a mile, the access road ended at an open field that stretched about a quarter mile before the tree line began in earnest. Usually I'd follow the edge of the field to a trail that cut through the woods, one that most of the local kids used. It wasn't dangerous, just steep enough and far enough out to feel like an adventure to a kid my age. But that day, something caught Rex's attention. He stopped at the end of the access road, his whole body going rigid. His ears perked up, and he started sniffing intensely at something in the snow. When I caught up to him, I noticed he was focused on some kind of tracks crossing the field. At first glance, I thought maybe someone else had come this way earlier that morning. But when I got closer, I realized these weren't normal footprints. They were huge, way too big to belong to anyone I knew. I knelt down to get a better look, the snow crunching under my knees. The first set of prints I examined was massive, easily 17 inches long. They were barefoot prints, with 5 distinct toes clearly visible in the fresh snow. They were deep too, like whoever or whatever had made them was really heavy. The weird thing was, right alongside this giant set was a smaller set. These were still big, about 10 inches long, but definitely smaller than the first. They had the same basic shape, 5 toes, clearly not wearing any shoes despite the freezing temperatures. The tracks seemed to be coming from the direction of the houses, maybe half a mile away from where I was standing, crossing the open field diagonally and heading up toward the more densely wooded area of the mountain. Rex was absolutely fixated on these tracks. He kept sniffing them, then looking up at the tree line, then back at the tracks. I'd never seen him act quite like this before. He wasn't growling or whining, just intensely curious. I followed the tracks with my eyes across the field. The snow was pristine except for these 2 sets of footprints making a straight line through the open space. They were evenly spaced, like they were walking calmly, not running or anything. I could see where they disappeared into the trees about 150 yards away. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. There was something deeply unsettling about those prints. Who would be walking barefoot in the snow, and why would there be 2 people of such different sizes doing it together? The only explanation my 11-year-old brain could come up with was that it was a parent and child, but that made even less sense. No parent would let their kid walk barefoot in the snow in March. I remember glancing back toward home, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. The normal winter forest sounds, chickadees, the occasional crow, distant traffic, all seemed muted. It was like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Rex had started walking along the tracks, nose to the ground, completely focused. He was about 20 feet ahead of me when I called out to him, "Rex, come back here, boy." He ignored me, which wasn't like him at all. "Rex, come!" I used my serious voice this time. He paused, looked back at me, then at the tracks, like he was torn. I whistled sharply, and he reluctantly trotted back, but kept looking over his shoulder at those tracks. I remember standing there, torn about what to do. Part of me, the curious kid part, wanted to follow those tracks to see where they led. But there was another part of me, some instinct I didn't fully understand, that was screaming at me to get away from there. The tracks weren't right. People don't have feet that big. People don't walk barefoot in the snow. People don't leave prints that deep unless they're carrying something really heavy. I decided to get a little closer, just to look at the prints more carefully. With Rex at my side, I approached the nearest footprint, one of the bigger ones. The impression was incredibly detailed. I could see the shape of an arch, the ball of the foot, the heel, and those 5 toes spread slightly apart. It looked human but not human at the same time. The toes were longer than they should be, and the foot was wider in proportion to its length than a normal human foot. And there was something else, a smell. It was faint, but definitely there. Kind of musky, like wet dog, but stronger and different. Rex noticed it too. His nostrils were flaring as he sniffed around the prints. I took a few more steps alongside the tracks, being careful not to disturb them. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Where the larger creature had stepped, there were occasional small drops of something dark in the snow. I bent down to look closer, and my breath caught in my throat. It was blood, small, partially frozen droplets of blood next to some of the larger footprints. That was it for me. Whatever curiosity I had was instantly replaced by fear. I grabbed Rex's collar, he was still transfixed by the scent, and started backing away. That's when I heard it. A sound from the direction of the tree line where the tracks disappeared. It wasn't loud, just a soft crack, like a branch breaking under weight. But in that quiet, snow-muffled landscape, it might as well have been a gunshot. Rex's head snapped up, his ears forward, entire body alert. I froze, staring at the distant trees, trying to see any movement. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard another sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite speech. It was brief, just a couple of seconds, but it echoed slightly against the mountain backdrop. Almost immediately, there was a higher-pitched sound in response, similar in quality but different in tone, like when an adult speaks and then a child answers. Rex let out a bark, just one, sharp and loud in the winter air. Then he did something that terrified me more than anything else. He tucked his tail between his legs and pressed against my leg, whining softly. Rex wasn't afraid of anything. He'd chase off coyotes that got too close to our yard. He'd stand his ground against the miller's mean Rottweiler. But whatever was in those trees had him scared. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed Rex's collar and we took off back down the access road, not running. I was afraid running might trigger something to chase us, but walking very, very quickly. I didn't look back until we reached the end of the Petersons' lot, nearly a mile away. When I finally did turn around, I half expected to see something following us. But the landscape was empty, just snow and trees and the distant mountain. If whatever made those tracks was watching us, I couldn't see it. I didn't tell my parents what happened when I got home. I knew my dad would either think I was making it up, or worse, he'd want to go look for himself. I didn't want anyone going near those tracks. Instead, I called my best friend Mike and told him everything. He got excited and wanted to go see for ourselves the next day. I refused. Whatever had made those tracks, I wanted nothing to do with it. The following morning, I woke up to the sound of rain hitting my window. By the time it stopped around noon, the snow was mostly gone, turned to grey slush that would wash away any trace of those footprints. Part of me was relieved. Another part wished I had taken pictures, or measured the prints more carefully, or done something to prove what I'd seen, because even then, barely 24 hours later, it all seemed dreamlike and impossible. A few weeks later, I overheard my dad talking to our neighbor about how someone's hunting dogs had gone missing up on Delworth, and how a few hikers had reported hearing strange noises at dusk. Dad laughed it off, saying people always got worked up about mountain lions this time of year. I almost told him then about what I'd seen, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear that he wouldn't believe me, or maybe it was something deeper, a feeling that what I'd encountered was something private between me and the mountain. I never saw tracks like that again, though I hiked those same trails hundreds of times before we moved away when I was 16. Rex never forgot, though. After that day, he would never go near that field again. If I tried to lead him that way, he'd plant his feet and refuse to move or tug me in another direction. Sometimes at night, especially in winter, I still dream about those tracks in the snow, one large, one small, and those strange sounds from the forest. I wonder if that smaller set of prints has grown over the years, becoming as large as its parents. I wonder if they're still out there on Delworth Mountain, leaving tracks that disappear before anyone can study them properly. And sometimes, very rarely when I'm camping and the forest gets too quiet, I think I hear that same rumbling vocalization in the distance. When that happens, I make sure my fire is good and bright, and I don't leave my tent until morning. Story 7. I never thought I'd be one of those people. You know the type, the ones who claim they've seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. I always laughed at those stories. But that was before August 20th, 1984. That day changed everything for me, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it almost 40 years later. My name's Bill. I was 32 back then, living in Burnaby, working construction. My buddy Gordon and I would go fishing or hiking on weekends, just to get away from the city noise. That particular Monday we both called in sick, don't tell my old boss, because the weather was perfect, and we wanted to check out this spot near Agassiz that Gordon's cousin had told us about. We drove out early, my old Chevy pickup rattling the whole way, Gordon complaining about my choice of music. It was about a 2-hour drive, and we spent most of it arguing about whether those fishing lures he'd bought were worth the money. Normal stuff. Nothing special about that morning. That's what makes what happened later so much harder to process. It was just a regular day. We parked off this logging road around 10 a.m. The plan was to hike to this creek Gordon's cousin said was full of trout. We grabbed our gear and started walking. It was hot already, that sticky August heat where your shirt clings to your back after 5 minutes. The forest was quiet except for birds and the crunch of our boots on the path. About an hour in, we came across this old gravel pit. It wasn't massive, maybe 30 yards across, with steep sides where they'd been digging out the gravel. The bottom was flat with some puddles from recent rain. We stopped at the edge to take a drink from our canteens. That's when I noticed something moving on the far side. At first, I thought it was a bear. We get lots of black bears around BC, nothing unusual about that. I nudged Gordon and pointed. "Check it out," I whispered. But as we both focused on it, something felt off. The way it moved wasn't right for a bear. It was trying to climb up the steep side of the pit, slipping on the loose gravel and sliding back down. The distance was maybe 115 to 145 feet across the pit from us, but even at that distance, I could tell this was big. Really big. "What the hell is that?" Gordon whispered, his voice tight. I shook my head. I had no idea, but curiosity got the better of us. We started making our way around the edge of the pit, trying to get a better look. As we got closer, maybe 100 feet away, I realized why it had seemed wrong for a bear. It was standing, not just rearing up occasionally like bears do, but fully upright on 2 legs, and it stayed that way the whole time. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The thing was huge, well over 6 feet tall, maybe closer to 7, and it was broad, solid-looking. If I had to guess, I'd say it weighed between 300 and 400 pounds. But the most striking thing was that it was covered in dark hair. Not fur like a bear, but longer hair that hung and moved with it. "Holy shit," Gordon breathed beside me. "Is that what I think it is?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone completely dry. We both stood frozen, watching as this creature kept struggling to climb out of the pit. It would get up a few feet, then the gravel would give way and it would slide back down, kicking up dust clouds. That's when it made the noise. God, that sound. I've been in the woods my whole life, heard cougars scream, bears roar, all kinds of wildlife. Nothing prepared me for that sound. It was like a howl, but deeper, powerful enough that I swear I felt it in my chest. A big, howling scream that echoed across the pit and up into the trees. It wasn't angry exactly, more frustrated, like it was pissed about not being able to climb out. Gordon grabbed my arm so tight it left bruises. "What the fuck, Bill?" he hissed. "What the actual fuck?" My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there watching this impossible thing. Then I remembered I had my camera. I'd brought it to take pictures of any big fish we caught. With shaking hands, I pulled it from my pack. It was just a basic 35mm, nothing fancy, but I raised it up and snapped a photo. The sound of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in that moment. The creature stopped moving and turned toward us. That's when I got my first clear look at its face. It wasn't a bear face. It wasn't human either, but it was... I don't know how to describe it except to say it had features. A flatter face than a bear, with deep-set eyes under a heavy brow. I couldn't make out details at that distance, but it was looking right at us. I'm certain of it. For about 3 seconds, we all just froze. Gordon and me on one side of the pit, this thing on the other, staring at each other. Then it started moving again, more frantically this time, really digging into the gravel wall, trying to climb out. I snapped another photo, then a third, as it finally found purchase and pulled itself up over the edge of the pit. It moved fast for something so big, surprisingly agile, it disappeared into the trees in seconds. Gordon and I stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Did you see that?" Gordon finally whispered, his voice cracking. "Tell me you saw that." "Yeah," I said. My own voice sounded strange to my ears. "I saw it." "That wasn't a bear," he said. "Bears don't stand like that. They don't look like that." "I know. We should have left right then. Any sane person would have. But there's something about seeing the impossible that makes you need proof. Something to convince yourself later that you weren't hallucinating. I want to check where it was," I said. Gordon looked at me like I was insane. "Are you kidding? What if it comes back?" "It ran the other way," I pointed out. "We'll be quick. I need to see if it left any tracks." Reluctantly, he agreed, and we made our way carefully around to where the creature had been. The gravel was all torn up from its struggle to climb out. There were depressions where it had stood, but nothing clear enough to call a footprint, just disturbed gravel. I took a picture of that too, though I doubted it would show much. That's when Gordon called me over. "Look at this," he said, pointing up to where the creature had finally escaped the pit. There was a branch broken off a tree about 7 feet up, fresh, with sap still oozing out. Whatever had passed by had been tall enough to snap it, and caught in the broken end were a few long, dark hairs. My hand trembled as I reached for them. They were about 3-4 inches long, coarse but not like bear fur. I put them in my empty sandwich bag. "We should go," Gordon said, glancing nervously at the forest. "Now." I agreed. We practically ran back to the truck, looking over our shoulders the whole way. Neither of us spoke much on the drive home. What was there to say? We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something I'd spent my whole life assuming was just a myth. When we got back to Burnaby, Gordon came to my place. We sat in my kitchen drinking beers, trying to process what we'd seen. I kept describing it over and over, as if saying it aloud would make it make sense. It was hairy, and everything else. It made one hell of a racket. It wasn't a bear, Gordon. It just wasn't. I dropped the film off for developing the next day. Those 3 days waiting for the photos felt like the longest of my life. When I finally got them back, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely open the envelope. The photos were disappointing, to be honest. What had been so clear to my eyes was just an indistinct dark shape against the gravel backdrop. You could tell something was there, something big, but the details were lost. I showed them to Gordon, who just shook his head in frustration. "Damn it," he said, "no one's going to believe this." But we tried anyway. We took our story and the photos to the local newspaper. The reporter looked at the pictures for a long time, then just shrugged and said they showed an indistinct, dark object against a dark background. Not exactly front-page material. We even tracked down this guy who researched Sasquatch sightings. He studied our photos for hours, asked us a million questions about what we'd seen, but in the end, he just sighed and said the photos were not conclusive. I could tell he believed we'd seen something, but the evidence wasn't strong enough. A few days later, on August 26th, Gordon and I went back with that researcher guy. We showed him the gravel pit. Surprisingly, we found what might have been a partial footprint nearby in some soft dirt, not in the pit itself, but in the forest where the creature had run. It was huge, maybe 16 inches long, but it was just a partial impression. The researcher took a cast of it anyway. We also found that broken branch still there, though the hairs were gone. Maybe the wind, maybe animals. The researcher took samples of the sap and measured how high the break was, about 7.2 off the ground. In the weeks that followed, I developed this weird obsession. I read every book about Sasquatch I could find. I pored over other people's accounts of sightings. So many of them matched what we'd seen, the height, the build. The way it moved, that terrible howling sound. Some people in town started calling us crazy. Others thought we were just looking for attention. My boss made Sasquatch jokes every time I walked into work. Even my own brother told me I probably just saw a bear, and my mind played tricks on me. But Gordon and I know what we saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. I've never gone public with this story before. What's the point? The photos didn't turn out. The footprint cast was inconclusive, and the hair samples were lost. It's just my word against everyone who says these things don't exist. All I know is this. Before August 20th, 1984, I was sure Sasquatches were just stories. Now I kind of believe in Sasquatches because what I saw is some kind of creature. It wasn't a bear, and I've never seen anything like that before or since. Sometimes I still wake up hearing that howl, that big, frustrated scream echoing across the gravel pit. And I wonder where it is now, that impossible thing I saw for just a few minutes, almost 40 years ago. Is it still out there in the forests of British Columbia? Are there others? And most of all, I wonder if our paths had crossed differently, if we'd surprised it instead of watching from a distance, would I be here to tell this story? I don't have answers. Just 3 blurry photos in a drawer, and the absolute certainty that there are things in this world we don't understand. Story 8. And I still can't sleep right when I remember what happened that night. It's been 38 years, and I've tried to forget, but some things just stick with you. It was July the 30th, 1985. Me and my wife Marie had been visiting her sister in Prince George and were driving back home to Smithers. We decided to take the long way around through Burns Lake because Marie wanted to stop at this little shop that sold homemade quilts. That's the kind of stupid decision that changes your life. If we'd just gone the direct way, none of this would have happened. We'd been on the road about 4 hours that day. It was getting dark, maybe around 9:30 p.m., but in northern BC in July you still have some light that time of night. That weird twilight where everything looks a little off, you know. We were in our old Ford station wagon, blue with the wood paneling on the sides. Not the fastest car, but it had always been reliable. Marie had fallen asleep about 20 minutes earlier. The radio was playing softly. I remember it was that song, The Power of Love, by Huey Lewis. The road was empty. We hadn't seen another car for at least half an hour. It was just us, the trees, and the darkening sky. We were on this narrow stretch about 30 miles outside Burns Lake, nothing but dense forest on both sides, tall pines crowding right up to the shoulder. No streetlights, no houses, just wilderness. The kind of road where your headlights only show you about 50 feet ahead, and the rest is just blackness. I was getting tired, so I rolled down my window a bit to get some fresh air. That's when I first noticed something weird. A smell. Like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I actually checked my shoes, thinking I'd stepped in something earlier. Then I heard it, a sound from the woods to my right. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch falling, but then it came again, a deep, throaty sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a moan. Something I'd never heard before. I still can't really describe it right. I nudged Marie awake. "Hey, you hear that?" I whispered. I don't know why I was whispering. There was nobody around for miles. She was groggy, rubbing her eyes. "What, Glenn?" That's when we both saw movement in the trees, just a flash of something big, really big. My headlights caught it for just a second as it moved between the trees, maybe 100 feet ahead of us. What was that? Marie was fully awake now, sitting up straight. "Probably just a moose," I said. But I knew it wasn't a moose. Wrong shape, wrong movement, too tall. I slowed down a bit to maybe 35 miles per hour. In retrospect, that was stupid. I should have floored it. But you don't think straight in those moments. You're curious. You want to make sense of what you're seeing. Marie rolled up her window tight. "I don't like this, Glenn." "It's fine," I said. But my hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. "Probably just a bear." And then it happened. It came out of the woods about 50 feet ahead of us from the right side. 1 second there was nothing, and the next second this thing was there. Standing at the edge of the road, I hit the brakes instinctively. The car skidded a bit, and we stopped maybe 30 feet from it. The headlights were shining right on it, and we both saw it clear as day. It was tall. So goddamn tall. Had to be over 8 feet, maybe closer to 9, and it was covered in dark hair or fur, not black, more like a dirty dark brown. But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that. This thing was standing on 2 legs, silhouetted against the trees. Its arms hung down to almost its knees. Its shoulders were massive, like a linebacker, but twice as wide. The face, I couldn't see the face clearly. It was sort of hidden in shadow, even with the headlights on it. But I could see its eyes reflecting the light. Yellow, like a cat's, but bigger, much bigger. Marie screamed. I remember her nails digging into my arm as she grabbed me. "Glenn, what is that? What is that?" I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry. The thing was just standing there, staring at us, not moving, just watching. I had this overwhelming feeling of being sized up, like it was deciding what to do with us. "Drive," Marie whispered frantically. "Glenn, drive." I snapped out of it and hit the gas. The station wagon lurched forward, and I swerved to go around the thing, giving it a wide berth to the left. As we passed it, I looked out my window, and it turned its head to follow us. That's when I saw its face better. It had a snout, sort of like a gorilla, but longer, and its mouth was open slightly, showing teeth. Big teeth. I thought we were clear. I really did. I was accelerating, maybe up to 40 miles per hour, when Marie screamed again. "It's following us!" I looked in the rearview mirror, and my blood went cold. The thing was running after us, on 2 legs, and it was gaining. I've been hunting all my life. I've seen deer run, I've seen bears run. Nothing moves like this thing moved. It was taking these huge strides, eating up the distance between us. I floored it. The station wagon wasn't exactly a sports car, but I had it up to maybe 50, then 60 miles per hour. But when I looked in the mirror again, it was still there, still coming. Then I heard it, this high-pitched screaming sound. Not like a person screaming, more like a cross between a mountain lion and some kind of bird. It was so loud it seemed to fill the car, even though all our windows were up. Marie was sobbing now, twisting around in her seat to look out the back window. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," she kept saying. I had the pedal to the floor, probably doing about 65 now, which was pushing it for that old car on that dark road. I was terrified we'd hit a curve too fast or blow a tire. Then came the first impact. Wham! Something hit the back of the car hard enough to make us lurch forward. Marie screamed. I almost lost control of the wheel. "It's hitting the car," Marie yelled. I couldn't believe it. We were doing over 60 miles per hour, and this thing was not only keeping up, but it was strong enough to hit the back of our station wagon hard enough to rock it. Wham! It hit us again, this time on the right rear side. The car swerved, and I had to fight to keep it on the road. I was fighting panic. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. My hands were sweating so bad I was afraid I'd lose my grip on the wheel. "What does it want?" Marie was hysterical. "Why is it doing this?" That's when I looked in the mirror again and saw it running right alongside the car on the passenger side. It was keeping pace with us at over 60 miles per hour. I could see its arms pumping, its legs taking these impossible strides, and it was looking right at us through the window. Marie saw it too and shrieked, pressing herself against me to get as far from the window as possible. The thing reached out. I'll never forget this. It reached out with one massive hand and slammed it against Marie's window. The glass didn't break, but I heard it crack. Its hand was huge, with these long fingers that seemed to end in claws or really thick nails. It screamed again, that awful sound, and hit the window a second time. Marie was practically in my lap by now, and I was struggling to keep the car on the road. I honestly thought we were going to die. I thought it was going to smash through the window, reach in, and tear us apart. I've never been so scared in my life. But then I saw lights ahead, headlights coming toward us. Another car. I started flashing my high beams frantically and laying on the horn. I looked to the side, and the thing was gone, just vanished. I checked the mirror, nothing behind us either. It had disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. The oncoming car passed us, an old pickup truck with an older man driving. He gave me an annoyed look as he passed, probably thinking I was some drunk idiot flashing my lights for no reason. I slowed down a bit, my heart still racing. Marie was sobbing quietly, her face buried in my shoulder. "Is it gone?" she whispered. "I think so," I said, but I kept checking the mirrors obsessively for the next 20 minutes until we reached Burns Lake. We drove straight to the RCMP station. I remember the officer at the desk looking at us like we were crazy when we burst in. We must have looked insane, both of us pale, shaking, Marie with mascara streaked down her face from crying. But he listened, and he called in a conservation officer named Peter Stent, who came down to take our statement. Stent was skeptical at first, but professional about it. He came out to look at our car with a flashlight, checking for marks or prints. He didn't find anything obvious. No clear handprints, no visible damage. But I know what happened. I know what we saw. And I know something hit our car multiple times that night. The officer asked us all kinds of questions. Had we been drinking? No. Had we seen any unusual wildlife in the area before? No. Did we get a clear enough look to compare it to known animals? Nothing like anything we'd ever seen. Stent seemed particularly interested when I mentioned the speed. When I told him this thing kept pace with us at over 60 miles per hour, his expression changed. He got more serious. "There's no known animal in these woods that can maintain that speed," he said, "especially not on two legs." We ended up staying in Burns Lake that night at a small motel. Neither of us could face getting back in that car and driving in the dark again. Marie didn't sleep at all. I maybe got an hour, but kept jerking awake from nightmares. The next morning, we drove the rest of the way home in broad daylight. We never took that route again, ever. After that night, Marie refused to go on any back roads. She wouldn't even go camping anymore, which was something we used to love. It changed her. Changed both of us. I've spent years trying to make sense of what we saw. I've read about bears, about moose, about every large animal in British Columbia. Nothing matches. I've even looked into other possibilities, things people report seeing in the woods that science doesn't acknowledge. I don't know what chased us that night. I don't know why it was so aggressive or how it could run that fast. But I know it was real. I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know the fear I felt was the most genuine thing I've ever experienced. It's been almost 4 decades, and I've never told this story outside of close family and the authorities. Marie still doesn't like to talk about it. She says remembering makes the nightmares come back. But I had to write this down, finally. Because sometimes I worry that as I get older, the memory will fade, and I need there to be a record. Not because I want to convince anyone, but because I need to remind myself that it really happened. Whatever was in those woods that night, it wasn't natural, and I hope to God I never see anything like it again. Story 9. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened to me on the Trans-Canada Highway back in July 1985. Even now, as I type this out, my hands are getting clammy and that same knot in my stomach is forming, the one that's been there every time I've thought about it for the past 38 years. I was 27 then, driving my old Ford pickup from Vancouver to Kelowna to visit my brother and his family. It was a beautiful summer day, warm but not too hot, perfect for a long drive. I'd made this trip dozens of times before, so I was comfortable with the route. The scenery through that stretch of British Columbia is breathtaking. Mountains, forests, everything so green and alive. I always enjoyed these solo drives, just me and the radio, no one to bother me. I'd left Vancouver around noon, figuring I'd reach Kelowna by early evening. I was making good time, cruising through Revelstoke around 6:30 p.m. The sun was still up, One of those long summer evenings where the light hangs around forever. Traffic was light. I'd pass another car every few minutes, but mostly I had the highway to myself. I wasn't tired. I'd stopped for coffee about an hour before, and I was alert, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel to some Eagles song on the radio. That's important. I want to be clear that what I saw wasn't because I was drowsy or not paying attention. I remember checking my fuel gauge and thinking I should stop for gas in the next town. That's when I noticed something moving in the ditch on the right side of the highway, maybe 300 feet ahead. At first, I thought it was a bear. We see them all the time in that part of the country, and I'd already spotted two earlier on my drive. But something felt off immediately. The movement wasn't right for a bear. It was too deliberate. I eased off the gas pedal slightly, not braking yet, but slowing down. As I got closer, this thing rose up from the ditch. I still struggled to describe what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or since. It stood up on two legs at the edge of the highway, and I swear to God it looked both ways like it was checking for traffic, like a person would. That's when I knew something was very wrong. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The creature was enormous. I'm not exaggerating when I say it must have been 8 or 9 feet tall. It had this stooped posture, not standing fully upright, but definitely on two legs. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, like a linebacker, but twice as wide. And its arms, they hung down almost to its knees, swinging slightly as it moved. I was probably about 200 feet away now, and I'd slowed to maybe 40 mph. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The thing was covered head to toe in this orange-brown hair. Not fur exactly, more like a shaggy coat that moved with the breeze. Then it stepped onto the highway, and I instinctively hit the brakes. Not hard enough to skid, just enough to slow down more. The creature turned its head and looked directly at me. I'll never forget that moment. Its face was... I don't know how to explain it. Not quite human, not quite animal. Dark eyes, set deep under a prominent brow. A flat nose. No snout like a bear would have. Its mouth was closed, but something about the jaw seemed powerful, massive. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably just a second or two. I felt recognized, not just seen, but acknowledged. Like it was thinking about me the same way I was thinking about it. Then it crossed the highway. It moved fast, covering the entire width in maybe 6 or 7 long strides. It didn't run, just walked with these enormous steps. Each footfall seemed deliberate, heavy. I remember thinking it must weigh 700 or 800 pounds, easy. The way it moved didn't match any animal I knew. Bears can walk on their hind legs for short distances, but they're awkward, clumsy. This thing moved with purpose, with a fluid gait that was unsettling precisely because it seemed so natural. It disappeared into the tree line on the other side of the highway. I sat there in my truck for a moment, engine idling, completely stunned. My heart was racing. I felt cold despite the summer heat. I'm not sure what possessed me, but I pulled over to the shoulder. I think part of me needed to confirm what I'd seen was real. I put the truck in park but left it running. I remember my hand shaking as I reached for the door handle. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to drive away, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to continue to my brother's house and have a normal evening. But I couldn't. I had to know. I stepped out of the truck. The highway was silent, no other cars in sight. I walked to the spot where the creature had entered the woods. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there in the mud were footprints. Not bear tracks. Not human tracks either, something in between, but huge. Each print was easily 16 inches long, with what looked like 5 toes. The stride length between them was enormous, at least 5 feet apart. I looked up from the tracks into the forest. The trees weren't especially dense there, and I could see maybe 100 yards in. Movement caught my eye. It was still visible, moving away through the trees. Its back was to me now, but even from behind, its shape was unmistakably not a bear. The way it walked, upright but with that stoop, swinging those long arms. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. For a crazy moment, I considered yelling to it. I don't know what I would have said. "Hey, stop!" The impulse passed quickly. I didn't want it to turn around. I didn't want it to come back. I thought about flagging down a passing car, finding someone else to witness this thing, but there was no one around. And what would I say? "Hey, pull over. There's a giant hairy man thing in the woods." By the time anyone stopped, it would be long gone. It was already moving fast, and the trees were getting thicker where it was heading. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just watching the spot where I'd last seen it moving through the trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. I've been an outdoorsman all my life. I've hunted, fished, and hiked throughout British Columbia. I know what a bear looks like, what a moose looks like, what every large mammal in these woods looks like. This wasn't any of them. The only conclusion I could come to, and it sounds crazy even now, was that I'd seen a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot. I'd always scoffed at those stories. I'd called them campfire tales, the product of too much whiskey or people mistaking bears in the twilight. But standing there, looking at those tracks, having seen it with my own eyes in broad daylight at a distance of just a few 100 feet, I couldn't deny it anymore. I took a few steps into the woods, following the tracks. The forest floor was covered in pine needles and fallen leaves, making the tracks harder to see beyond the muddy edge of the highway. I stopped after about 20 feet. What was I doing? Tracking this thing, alone. It outweighed me by 600 pounds at least. I wasn't armed. I didn't even have a camera to document what I was seeing. I backed up to the highway, never taking my eyes off the forest. When I reached my truck, I practically jumped inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down, trying to process what I'd seen. I've replayed that encounter in my mind thousands of times since then. Every detail is burned into my memory. The way it moved, the breadth of its shoulders, the color of its hair, the way it turned and looked at me, calm, aware, intelligent. I continued on to Kelowna that evening, arriving at my brother's place around 8 p.m. He asked why I looked so pale, if I was feeling okay. I told him I was just tired from the drive. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone for years. When I drove back through that same stretch of highway a week later, I slowed down and looked carefully at the spot. Of course, there was nothing to see. The tracks would have been washed away by rain or filled in by forest debris. The creature, whatever it was long gone. Over the years, I've read books about Sasquatch sightings. I've watched documentaries. I've even, on a few occasions, quietly attended gatherings of people who claim to have had similar experiences. Some of their stories sound like fiction, like they're embellishing for attention, but others have that ring of truth. They describe the same movements, the same intelligent gaze, the same feeling of being recognized by something that shouldn't exist. I never reported my sighting to any official channel. What would be the point? The Forestry Service would dismiss it. The police would think I was crazy or attention-seeking. Scientists would demand evidence I didn't have. So I kept it to myself, this bizarre experience that changed how I view the world and what might live in it. I still drive that stretch of highway sometimes. I always slow down near that spot, always scan the tree line. I've never seen it again. Part of me hopes I never do. Part of me wishes desperately for another glimpse, for confirmation that I didn't imagine the whole thing. I know what I saw that day wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. It wasn't a man in a costume. No costume could capture that fluid, natural movement, that sheer mass and height. It wasn't a case of mistaken identity or road fatigue or my eyes playing tricks. I saw something that day that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that walks on two legs through the forests of British Columbia, crossing highways when it thinks no one is watching. Something that looks both ways before it crosses. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest there's a creature that occasionally thinks about the human in the pickup truck who stopped and watched it cross the road on a summer evening in 1985. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. I don't think I ever will. All I know is what I saw, and what I saw has haunted me for almost 4 decades. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm just finally telling my story. Story 10. Mr. Sousa, it's been 38 years, and I've barely told a soul about what happened. I figured it was finally time to write it down. Maybe someone out there has seen something similar. Maybe I'm not crazy after all. I was 32 back in 1985, living in a small cabin about 20 minutes outside Queen Charlotte City. I'd moved there after my divorce, looking for peace, looking to start over. Fishing had always been my escape, the one thing that made sense when nothing else did. That summer was unusually warm. I remember because the salmon runs were different that year. Coming in later, more sporadic. I'd been hitting the Honor River 3, sometimes 4 times a week, trying to make a decent catch. Nothing extraordinary. Just a guy with a rod, some tackle, and too many thoughts. June 17th. That date is burned into my memory. I'd taken the day off from the cannery where I worked, left my place around 5:30 a.m., packed light, just my gear, a thermos of coffee, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The morning fog was still hanging over the water when I pulled my old Ford pickup into my usual spot. No other vehicles around, which wasn't surprising. It was Monday, and most locals who fished were already at work. The spot I favored was about a half-mile walk from the parking area, a little bend in the river where it widened slightly before narrowing again downstream. Good current, deep enough pools that consistently produced decent catches. The path there was overgrown that summer, salmonberry bushes reaching across the trail like they were trying to grab you. I remember swatting them away, cursing under my breath when they caught my fishing vest. I settled in at my spot around 6:15. The morning was quiet, that deep kind of forest quiet where you can hear water droplets falling from leaves. Birds were just starting to call. I remember the smell of the wet earth, the river, and that distinctive scent of spruce and cedar that's like nowhere else on earth. By 8:30, I'd caught 2 decent-sized coho salmon. Nothing spectacular, but enough to justify the morning. The sun had burned off the fog, and I was considering packing up early, maybe heading to town for supplies before going home. That's when I noticed the deer. It emerged from the trees about 40 yards upstream from me on the opposite bank. A small doe, probably young by the look of her. There was something odd about the way she moved. No hesitation. No nervous head bobbing or stopping to listen for danger like you'd expect. She just walked right out to the edge of the river and started drinking. I froze, fishing rod still in hand. Any movement would have spooked her, so I just stood there watching. It's not unusual to see deer while fishing, but something felt off about this one. Too comfortable, too, I don't know, domesticated almost. The doe kept drinking, occasionally lifting her head, but never looking around nervously like deer normally do. She was maybe there for a minute, maybe less when it happened. A rock, not a small stone, but a rock about the size of a softball, came flying out of the trees behind her. It hit her square in the hindquarters with enough force that I heard the impact from where I stood. The doe's legs buckled immediately, and she went down on her side, thrashing weakly. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Rocks don't just fly out of forests. Someone had to have thrown it. But the force behind it, Jesus, it was like it had been launched from a cannon. Before I could even move, the trees parted. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what I saw next, trying to tell myself it was a bear standing upright, or maybe a man in some kind of costume. But I know what I saw. It was massive, 7 feet tall at minimum, probably closer to 8, covered in dark brown hair or fur that hung in matted clumps from its body. Not like a bear's fur, longer, more human-like in how it hung, but it wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, reaching almost to its knees. Shoulders too broad for even the burliest logger. It moved with purpose, striding directly to the fallen deer. There was a brutal efficiency to its movements, not clumsy or lumbering like you'd expect from something that size. It bent down, grabbed the deer by the neck and back leg, and in one fluid motion hoisted the animal over its shoulder. The deer must have weighed at least 80–90 pounds, but this thing lifted it like it was nothing more than a sack of flour. I stood paralyzed. My fishing rod slipped from my fingers, but I didn't hear it hit the ground. All I could focus on was this creature. It turned slightly, adjusting the weight of the deer, and for a split second I caught a glimpse of its face. That's what haunts me most at night. Not quite human, not quite animal. A heavy brow ridge shadowed its eyes, a broad, flat nose, a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. I couldn't make out details from that distance, but I didn't need to. Everything in my body was screaming danger. It happened so fast. The creature took 2 steps back toward the tree line, still carrying the deer, and then paused. It turned its head in my direction. I don't know if it saw me or smelled me or just sensed my presence somehow, but in that moment, standing knee-deep in the river with my heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest, I knew it was aware of me. It didn't make any sound, didn't charge or make threatening movements. It just looked, and then, with a speed that defied its size, it disappeared back into the forest. No crashing through underbrush, no breaking branches. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, taking the deer with it. I don't remember dropping my thermos, but I must have because I found it later, downstream, half submerged in river water. I don't remember scrambling out of the river either, but I remember running, my boots squelching, soaked from the river, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipping my face as I tore down the path back to my truck. I left my fishing gear, left my catch. I just ran. When I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I remember slamming it locked behind me and just sitting there, gasping for breath, scanning the tree line, convinced that at any moment that thing would emerge from the forest and come for me next. I drove back to Queen Charlotte City like the devil himself was chasing me. Must have been doing 70 on those winding roads, which was insane. I didn't stop at home. Didn't stop anywhere until I reached Jimmy's bar on the edge of town. It wasn't even open yet. It was barely 9:30 in the morning. But Jimmy was there doing inventory, and he let me in when he saw the state I was in. "Jesus Christ, Mike. You look like you've seen a ghost," he said as he poured me a whiskey. I downed it in one gulp and asked for another. I wasn't a heavy drinker, but that morning I needed something to steady my nerves. "Not a ghost," I finally managed to say, but I couldn't tell him, couldn't form the words. What was I supposed to say? That I'd just seen Bigfoot hunt a deer with a rock? That I'd looked into the eyes of something that wasn't supposed to exist? So I lied. Told him I'd nearly been attacked by a bear. He believed me. Bear encounters weren't uncommon. He gave me another drink on the house and told me I should report it to the Forestry Service. I nodded and said I would. But I never did. Later that afternoon, after the whiskey had worn off and the initial shock had faded to a dull, persistent dread, I forced myself to go back. I had to get my gear, and irrationally, I needed to confirm what I'd seen. Needed to know I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing. I brought my rifle this time, a Winchester 30-06 that I kept for protection against bears and cougars. I'd never used it on anything larger than a paper target, but its weight was reassuring as I made my way back down the trail, constantly scanning the forest around me. My fishing spot looked normal, peaceful even. My rod was still there, lying on the riverbank where I'd dropped it. My creel with the 2 salmon was gone, probably carried off by a scavenger. There was no sign of the deer, no blood on the opposite bank, nothing to indicate what I'd witnessed just hours before. But as I was gathering my rod, something caught my eye. Across the river where the creature had emerged from the forest, several saplings were bent and broken. Not in the random way that weather might damage them, but in a pattern consistent with something large pushing through. And on the muddy bank, barely visible, was a single impression that might have been a footprint. Too large for a human, too shaped for a bear. I didn't stay to investigate further. I grabbed my rod and practically ran back to my truck. I didn't fish the Honor River again that summer, or ever really. In the weeks that followed, I came up with 100 explanations for what I'd seen. Stress-induced hallucination, a bear walking upright combined with an overactive imagination. Hell, maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I just couldn't bring myself to tell anyone, not the local authorities, not my co-workers, not even my closest friends. Who would believe me? And the ones who might entertain the possibility would want me to go public, to take them to the spot, to search for evidence. The thought of going back there, of potentially encountering that creature again, I couldn't do it. So I kept quiet, kept it to myself for 38 years. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind rattles my windows, I still see it in my mind. That massive figure emerging from the trees, the calculated way it brought down the deer with a thrown rock. The intelligence behind that act was what terrified me most. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. This was a being that could think, plan, use tools. I moved away from Queen Charlotte City the following year. Couldn't stand the constant feeling of being watched whenever I ventured near the forest. Couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. I've lived in Victoria ever since, surrounded by people and buildings and the comforting sounds of civilization. But sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, still hunting on the banks of the Honor River, still watching fishermen from the shadows of the forest. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I remember that moment when it turned and looked in my direction. In my darkest thoughts, I wonder if it remembers me too. I don't expect anyone to believe this. Hell, most days I can barely believe it myself. But it happened. June 17th, 1985. The day I saw something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that changed how I see the world and my place in it. And to this day, I still can't explain what I saw on the Honor River. Story 11. I've been hesitating to share this for nearly 40 years now. My wife, Janet, and I talked about it for years afterward, but mostly kept it between ourselves and a few close friends. I'm 72 now, and frankly, I don't care anymore what people think. I know what we saw that day in April 1986, and I want to get it written down while I still have all my faculties. We'd moved to British Columbia from Seattle a few years earlier. I'd gotten a job with a lumber company, and we found a little place outside Long Butte that suited us fine. Beautiful country up there. Dense forests, mountains, lakes, everywhere you look. We spent most weekends exploring the wilderness. Janet was big into bird watching, and I just loved being outdoors after spending weekdays cooped up in an office. That particular Saturday was unusually warm for April. The snow had melted except on the highest peaks, and there was that fresh green smell in the air that only comes in early spring. We packed a lunch, put our German Shepherd Max in the back of our Jeep, and headed out to a spot about 20 miles from our house. There was this hill Janet and I had discovered the previous fall that had an amazing view of the valley below. You could see for miles up there. We parked at the base of the trail and hiked up, which took about 45 minutes. Max ran ahead, doubling back every few minutes to make sure we were still following. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, just steep in places, winding through a mixed forest of pine and cedar. When we reached the top, we found our usual spot, a flat, rocky outcropping that gave us a panoramic view of the valley. Below us, maybe half a mile away, a rural road curved through the trees. It wasn't heavily traveled, mostly just locals and the occasional logging truck. We spread out our blanket, broke out the thermos of coffee, and sat enjoying the view. Janet had her binoculars out, scanning the trees for birds. Max was sniffing around the perimeter of the outcropping, doing his dog thing. It was around 11:30 when Janet suddenly grabbed my arm. "John, look at that," she said, pointing down toward the road. At first I didn't see anything unusual. "There, on the curve," she insisted, handing me the binoculars. I focused on the section of road that curved around a stand of trees. That's when I saw it. Walking along the edge of the pavement was what I first thought was a person. But something was off. Even from that distance I could tell it was huge, way bigger than any human I'd ever seen. And the way it moved was strange, deliberate but fluid like an athlete. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, even though there was no way whatever it was could hear us from that distance. "I don't know," Janet said, taking the binoculars back. "It's not a bear. Bears don't walk like that." She was right. This thing was walking completely upright on two legs. Not the awkward upright waddle bears sometimes do, but fully erect, like a human. But it wasn't human. I was sure of that. It was covered in dark fur, either very dark brown or black. It was hard to tell with the sunlight. And it was massive, thick, muscular shoulders and arms that hung down at its sides. We watched it for maybe 30 seconds as it walked along the curve of the road. Then, as if sensing it was being observed, it suddenly turned and looked up in our general direction. I felt a chill run down my spine. Even though it was too far away to make out facial features clearly, I had the distinct impression it was staring right at us. Max started growling low in his throat, which was unusual for him. He wasn't an aggressive dog, but something about this thing set him off. After what felt like forever, but was probably just a few seconds, the creature turned away and stepped off the road into the tree line. It pushed through some bushes and disappeared from view. Janet and I just sat there in stunned silence. Finally, she said, "That wasn't a bear." "No," I agreed. "Bears have snouts. That thing had a flat face. And bears don't walk like that, not for that long. That was walking exactly like a person. A really big person," I added. "Did you see the shoulders on that thing? It was built like a linebacker, but taller." We stayed on the hill for another hour or so, hoping it might reappear, but it never did. The whole drive home, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was just a very large man in dark clothing. But that didn't explain the way it moved or its proportions. Maybe it was a bear with some kind of deformity that made it walk upright. But again, the fluid motion and the flat face didn't fit. By the time we got home, we'd settled on the explanation that neither of us wanted to say out loud. We had seen what people around here called a Sasquatch. The thing is, I'd always scoffed at those stories, thought they were just tall tales told by drunk loggers or attention seekers. But what we saw that day didn't fit any other explanation. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the sighting in my mind, questioning if I had really seen what I thought I saw. By morning, I knew I had to go back. I needed to get a better sense of the size of this thing, to confirm I wasn't exaggerating it in my memory. I called my buddy Mike, who lived nearby. He'd grown up in the area and knew the woods better than anyone. I didn't tell him exactly what we'd seen, just said we'd spotted something unusual from the hilltop and I wanted to check it out. Mike agreed to meet me, and by 9 a.m. we were back at the trailhead. Janet stayed home. She said once was enough for her, and honestly I think the whole thing had shaken her more than she let on. Max came with us, though. As we hiked up, I filled Mike in on what we'd seen, trying to stick to the facts without sounding like a lunatic. To his credit, he didn't laugh or roll his eyes. People who live in remote areas like this tend to be more open-minded about the woods and what might be in them. When we reached the top, I showed Mike exactly where we'd been sitting and pointed out the section of road where we'd spotted the creature. "The thing is," I explained, "from up here it's hard to judge size accurately, but this thing looked massive." Mike thought for a moment, then said, "I know which part of the road you can see from here. Let's go down there. I'll stand on the spot and you come back up here. Then you can compare my height to what you saw." It was a good idea. We hiked back down, and Mike drove us around to the section of road visible from the hilltop. He parked, got out, and walked to the curve where we'd seen the creature. Max immediately started sniffing around excitedly, his nose to the ground. "I'll stay here," Mike called up to me. "You go back up and call me when you get there." I hiked back up alone, which took about 30 minutes. When I reached our viewing spot, I called Mike on the walkie-talkie we'd brought. "I'm here. Can you see me?" His voice crackled through the speaker. "Yeah, I can see you." Mike was standing exactly where the creature had been. He was about 6'1", a good-sized guy, but from my vantage point, he looked tiny compared to what Janet and I had seen. "Walk the path the thing took," I instructed him. He followed the same route, walking along the edge of the road and then turning into the trees where the creature had disappeared. "Based on what you're seeing," Mike's voice came through again, "how tall would you say this thing was compared to me?" I tried to be conservative, to not let my imagination run away with me. "At least 2 feet taller than you," I finally said. "Maybe more, and about twice as wide in the shoulders. So we're talking about an 8-foot-tall creature?" Mike's voice had a hint of disbelief now. "At least," I confirmed, "and it wasn't thin either. It was solidly built." Mike went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Max is going crazy down here. His nose is glued to the ground, and he's pulling toward the trees where you said this thing went." "Follow him," I said, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I watched through the binoculars as Mike let Max lead him into the tree line. They disappeared from my view, but I could hear occasional updates through the walkie-talkie. "There's definitely a trail here," Mike reported after a few minutes. "Not a human trail. The vegetation is all pushed down, branches broken. Something big came through here recently." I felt a chill again, the same one I'd felt when the creature had looked our way. How's Max acting? Like he's on the hunt. Never seen him this focused. I started making my way back down the hill, wanting to see this trail for myself. By the time I reached the road, Mike and Max had followed the trail for several hundred yards. I caught up with them near a small, swampy area that fed into a larger lake. The trail of crushed vegetation and broken branches was obvious, even to my untrained eye. It led straight to the water's edge and stopped. Max was pacing back and forth at the shore, whining in frustration. The scent trail he'd been following disappeared into the water. Mike stood with his hands on his hips, looking out across the small lake. "Whatever it was, it went in here," he said. "Probably swam across to the other side." The lake wasn't large, maybe 200 yards across, but the opposite shore was thick with vegetation, impossible to see through clearly. "Do you believe me now?" I asked him. Mike nodded slowly. "I've lived in these woods my whole life, John. I've seen every animal that's supposed to be here. Whatever made this trail isn't on any wildlife pamphlet." We stood there for a while, staring at the lake, both of us hoping and maybe also fearing that we might catch another glimpse of the creature. But there was nothing, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a bird. Finally, Mike said, "We should head back. It'll be dark in a few hours." As we walked back to his truck, he asked, "You gonna report this? Call Fish and Wildlife or something?" I thought about it. "And tell them what? That I saw a Sasquatch? They'd laugh me out of the county." Mike shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. You'd be surprised how many sightings there are around here that don't make the papers." But in the end, I didn't report it officially. I did mention it to a few trusted friends over the years, and eventually to a researcher who was collecting Sasquatch accounts in the area. But I never went public with it. The ridicule wasn't worth it, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted our spot to become some kind of Sasquatch tourism destination. Janet and I continued hiking in those woods for years afterward, though we never went back to that particular hill. We never saw the creature again, but sometimes when we were deep in the forest, I'd get that same feeling I had when it looked our way, like we were being watched. I've thought about that day thousands of times over the years. I've questioned my own memory, wondered if Janet and I somehow mutually hallucinated, tried to convince myself it was just a large man or an unusually proportioned bear. But I know what I saw. And when I think about the size comparison with Mike, the trail through the woods, and Max's reaction, I know it wasn't any animal officially recognized by science. Whatever it was, walking along that curved road in April 1986, it wasn't supposed to exist, but it did. It does, and it's still out there in those woods, watching hikers from the trees, crossing roads when it thinks no one is looking, swimming across lakes to avoid detection. Sometimes I wonder if it thinks about us too, the two humans who sat on that hill and spotted it on one of the rare occasions it let its guard down. Did it learn from that mistake? Is it more careful now? I'll never know. But I know what I saw, and despite almost 4 decades of trying to convince myself otherwise, I still believe it was real. Story 12. My dad was a long-haul trucker back in the 80s. Mum had left us when I was 7, and during school breaks, Dad would take me along on his routes, rather than paying for a sitter. I loved those trips, staying up late, eating at truck stops, and listening to his CB radio conversations with other drivers. I felt grown up, like I was his little co-pilot. In the spring of 1986, we were hauling a load through British Columbia on the Trans-Canada Highway. Dad had picked me up from school on Friday, and we'd been on the road for about 2 days. The trip had been normal. We played I Spy, listened to cassette tapes, and Dad let me have an extra soda at dinner, even though Mom would have freaked about the sugar so late. It was a clear night with a half moon, and we were somewhere outside Golden. I remember because Dad had pointed out the town sign hours earlier, saying we'd be stopping there the next day to get some famous local ice cream. I was fighting to stay awake, determined to make it to midnight like a big kid. Dad had the radio tuned to some classic rock station that kept fading in and out as we wound through the mountains. Around 1:30 a.m., Dad started rubbing his eyes and yawning. The road ahead was completely empty. We hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 20 minutes. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating just the asphalt and dense forest on either side of the highway. "Buddy, I need to pull over for a bit," Dad said, stifling another yawn. "Just need to rest my eyes for 15 minutes, then we'll find a proper place to sleep." I nodded, excited about the adventure of stopping along the highway in the middle of the night. Dad eased the truck onto a wide shoulder, where a small gravel turnout provided space away from the road. He kept the engine running but turned off the headlights to save the battery. The dash lights cast a greenish glow inside the cab, and the radio was turned down low. "Just gonna close my eyes for a few minutes," Dad mumbled, leaning his head back. "Wake me if you see another truck coming." I was still wide awake, feeling special for being the lookout. Through the windshield, I could see the moon illuminating the tops of the pine trees. The forest looked different at night, darker, deeper, more mysterious. Being a kid, I imagined all sorts of creatures living in there, but in a fun way, like the fantasy books I loved to read. Dad's breathing had just started to deepen when I noticed movement at the edge of the tree line, about 50 feet ahead of our truck. At first, I thought it was just branches swaying in the wind, but there was no wind that night. Everything was still. Then I saw it clearly. Something big was moving at the edge of the forest. I leaned forward in my seat, hands pressed against the dashboard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The moonlight wasn't very bright, but it was enough to make out a large, dark shape emerging from between 2 tall pines. My first thought was bear, because we'd seen warnings about them at the last rest stop, but this thing wasn't moving like a bear. It was walking upright, on two legs, and it was huge, much taller than my dad, who was over 6 feet. For a few seconds, I was just curious, not scared. My brain was trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was another trucker who'd pulled over earlier and was walking back to the road. But as it moved further into the clearing, I could tell this wasn't a person. The proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees, and it was covered in dark hair or fur that I could see even in the dim light. I wanted to wake Dad, but I was suddenly frozen, unable to move or speak. The creature took another step forward, and now I could see it was looking directly at our truck. It tilted its head slightly, like it was curious. That's when my heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. In my child's mind, I thought gorilla. I'd seen them at the zoo, and this thing moved like that, but bigger and scarier because gorillas weren't supposed to be in Canadian forests. It stood there for a moment, completely still, except for its head, which slowly turned as it seemed to study our truck. Then it started walking towards us. Not running, not charging, just a deliberate, purposeful walk on two legs. Each step was heavy enough that I imagined I could feel the ground vibrate. Its arms swung slightly at its sides, and its head remained fixed in our direction. That's when I finally found my voice. I reached over and grabbed Dad's arm, squeezing as hard as I could. "Dad!" I whispered urgently, then louder. "Dad, wake up!" He jerked awake, immediately alert the way parents get when their kids are scared. "What? What's wrong?" he asked, looking around quickly. I didn't even look at him. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing that was now about 30 feet from our truck and still coming. "Dad, there's something out there. Please, can we go, please?" My voice was shaking and I was on the verge of tears. Dad followed my gaze but didn't immediately see what had terrified me. "Where? What are you—" "Please, Dad, go now!" I was fully panicking, pulling on his sleeve and pointing frantically through the windshield. Dad didn't ask any more questions. He threw the truck into gear and hit the headlights at the same time. The sudden bright light illuminated the area in front of us, and for a split second, just before Dad accelerated back onto the highway, I saw it clearly. It stood maybe 15 feet in front of our truck now, frozen in the headlights. It was at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and that dark matted hair covering its entire body. Its face was partially shadowed, but I could see glinting eyes reflecting the headlights and what looked like a flattened nose above a wide mouth. As Dad floored it, the truck lurched forward, and the thing actually reached out one long arm toward us. I'm certain, though Dad didn't believe this part later, that its hand actually brushed against the front bumper as we sped away. I was completely hysterical by this point, crying and babbling as Dad accelerated down the highway. He kept checking the mirrors, driving well above the speed limit for at least 15 minutes before he felt safe enough to slow down. "It's okay, buddy, it's okay," he kept saying, though I could hear the tension in his voice. "Whatever it was, we're away from it now." Once I'd calmed down enough to speak coherently, Dad asked me what I'd seen. "A gorilla, Dad. It was a gorilla. It was coming up to the truck." I was still shaking, absolutely convinced of what I'd seen. Dad looked at me with concern. "A gorilla in British Columbia. I know what I saw. It was walking like a person, on 2 legs, I insisted. "It reached the truck, Dad. It touched it." Dad was skeptical but didn't dismiss me outright. He knew I was genuinely terrified, and he'd raised me not to make up stories. "Are you sure it wasn't a bear standing up? They do that sometimes." "No, it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that. It was like a person but hairy all over, like the pictures of Bigfoot in my book. I'd recently gotten a book about mysteries and unexplained phenomena for my birthday, and there had been a chapter on Bigfoot with illustrations." Dad sighed when I mentioned this, probably thinking my imagination had run wild. "Well, whatever it was, it's behind us now," he said firmly. We'll find a motel in the next town and get some proper sleep." We drove for another hour before finding a small motel that still had its vacancy sign lit. Dad checked us in, and I refused to let him go back to the truck alone to get our overnight bags. I clung to his hand the entire time, scanning the parking lot and the tree line beyond for any sign of the creature. I barely slept that night, lying awake, listening to every creak and sound outside our room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing reaching for our truck. I kept imagining what would have happened if Dad hadn't woken up when he did, if we'd stayed parked there just a minute longer. The next morning, Dad inspected the truck before we got back on the road. He was humoring me, I think, looking for scratches or handprints on the bumper where I claimed the creature had touched it. "See? Nothing there," he said, patting my shoulder. "Probably just a bear or even a moose in the shadows. Your eyes can play tricks on you in the dark." But I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, and it wasn't my imagination. The way it moved was too deliberate, too human-like. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable. It had been curious about us, approaching our truck deliberately to investigate. For the rest of that trip, I refused to let Dad pull over on deserted stretches of road, even during daylight hours. I'd start panicking if he even mentioned being tired. We stuck to proper rest stops and well-lit truck stops with other vehicles around. Dad never brought up what happened, probably hoping I'd forget about it, as kids often do with nightmares or scary experiences. But I never forgot. In fact, as I got older and learned more about the Pacific Northwest and its folklore, I became convinced that what I saw that night was what local indigenous people call Sasquatch and others know as Bigfoot. The region around Golden, BC, has had numerous reported sightings over the years, though few people talk about them openly for fear of ridicule. Dad passed away last year, and among his effects was a journal I'd never seen before. In it, he'd kept notes about various trips and experiences from his trucking days. I found an entry dated 2 days after our incident near Golden. Bobby swears he saw something outside Golden, says it was a gorilla or a Bigfoot. Kid was genuinely terrified. Didn't see anything myself, but something feels off about that stretch of road. Called Jake, who runs that route regularly, says other drivers avoid stopping there at night. Local legend about something in those woods, probably nothing, but won't be pulling over there again. Reading that gave me chills. Dad never admitted to me that he gave any credence to my story, but clearly he'd had enough doubt to ask around about it. I've driven through that area as an adult multiple times. It's much more developed now, with more traffic and fewer isolated stretches. But every time I pass through, I feel my heart rate increase, and I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that tall, dark figure emerging from the forest. Whatever I saw that night in 1986 was real. It was intelligent enough to be curious about our truck, bold enough to approach us directly, and only the quick action of my father prevented what could have been a much closer encounter. I don't know if it meant us harm or was simply curious, but I'm grateful we didn't have to find out. To this day, I can't explain what I saw, but I know it wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. And sometimes in my dreams, I still see those eyes reflecting in our headlights and that long arm reaching for our truck as we speed away into the night. Story 13. I've been debating whether to share this for a long time. It happened back in '86, and it still gives me chills thinking about it. My name is Adam, and my buddy Lucas and I experienced something at Sasquatch Provincial Park that I can't explain to this day. Yeah, I know how that sounds. We saw something weird at a park literally named after Sasquatch. Trust me, the irony isn't lost on me. It was May 21st, 1986. Lucas and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We were both finishing up our sophomore year of college and needed to blow off some steam before summer jobs kicked in. Neither of us was particularly outdoorsy, but we'd done enough camping to know the basics. We picked Sasquatch Provincial Park near Harrison Hot Springs because we'd heard Deer Lake was beautiful in the spring and the fishing was supposed to be decent. We arrived around midday and spent a couple hours finding what we thought was the perfect spot, a small clearing in a meadow near a water pump. There was a hill behind us that gave some shelter from the wind, and the whole area just felt right. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the afternoon fishing. I remember catching a small trout, but Lucas got skunked. We laughed about it while cooking hot dogs over the fire as the sun went down. Looking back, I keep trying to remember if there were any warning signs during the day, any weird noises or feelings of being watched. But there was nothing. Just a normal day of camping. We stayed up shooting the shit until maybe midnight, drinking a few beers, not enough to be drunk, just relaxed, and eventually crawled into our sleeping bags around 12:30. I fell asleep pretty quickly. The next thing I knew, Lucas was shaking me awake. That's when everything changed. "Adam," he whispered, grabbing my shoulder, "someone's outside the tent." I was groggy, annoyed at being woken up. "What?" "It's probably just an animal," I mumbled. "No," he insisted, his voice tight with fear. "Someone looked in. I saw a face." That got my attention. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. "What do you mean, a face?" "I don't know," Lucas whispered. I woke up and there was something looking in through the tent flap. I thought it was a person at first, but what? It didn't look right. The proportions were off. I grabbed my flashlight and checked my watch. It was just after 3 a.m. The campsite was dead quiet, except for the normal nighttime forest sounds. No voices, no footsteps, just crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I'm going to check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Lucas grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? What if it's a bear?" "Bears don't look into tents, Lucas," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure about that. "Besides, if it is a bear, we shouldn't stay in the tent. We're basically just wrapped in a thin nylon sandwich bag." I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and poked my head out. The night was clear, with a half moon providing just enough light to see the outlines of the trees and our campsite. Nothing seemed immediately out of place. No people, no animals. I stepped out, wearing just my jeans and a t-shirt. The air was chilly against my skin. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. Scanning the campsite, our cooler was untouched. The remains of our fire had burned down to embers. Everything seemed normal. That's when I noticed a light downhill from our position, maybe 50 yards away. A flashlight beam moving slowly through the trees. Had someone else set up camp nearby without us noticing? Were they taking a middle-of-the-night bathroom break? "Lucas," I called softly back into the tent. "There's someone down there with a flashlight." Lucas crawled out beside me, also fully dressed. Neither of us had bothered to change into pajamas or anything the night before. "Where?" he whispered. I pointed toward the light. "Down there. Maybe it's just another camper." "At 3 a.m.? Walking around in the dark?" He had a point. It was weird timing for a casual stroll. "Hello?" I called out. Not too loud, but enough that they might hear me if they were just another camper. "Everything okay down there?" No response. The light continued moving slowly, methodically, like someone searching for something. "Should we call out again?" Lucas asked. I was about to answer when the light suddenly went out. Complete darkness. I instinctively turned on my own flashlight and pointed it in the direction where I'd last seen the light. That's when I saw it. Standing there, caught in my flashlight beam, was something. It wasn't a person, at least not any kind of person I'd ever seen. It was tall, I'd estimate 7 or 8 feet, and covered in brown hair or fur. It was standing upright, on 2 legs, perfectly still, staring directly at us. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think clearly. It was like my brain short-circuited trying to process what I was seeing. "Holy shit," Lucas whispered beside me. "What the fuck is that?" His voice broke the spell. The thing, whatever it was, suddenly turned and started moving away from us. But it didn't move like a person. It ran with this weird, fluid gait that was both incredibly fast and somehow graceful. I kept my flashlight trained on it as it moved, watching as it effortlessly jumped over a fallen tree stump that must have been at least 4 feet high. Then it disappeared into the tree line. I stood there, flashlight still pointed where it had vanished, my hand shaking so badly the beam was dancing all over the place. "Did you see that?" I finally managed to say. Lucas didn't answer. I looked over and saw him staring, wide-eyed, in the direction the thing had gone. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the moonlight. "Lucas?" "Yeah," he whispered. "I saw it." We stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, both afraid to move. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just absolute stillness. "We should get back in the tent," Lucas finally said. I nodded, but neither of us moved. Going back into the tent suddenly seemed like a terrible idea, like voluntarily climbing into a nylon coffin, but standing out in the open felt even worse. "What did you see?" I asked him, needing confirmation that we'd witnessed the same thing. "It wasn't human," he said, his voice shaking. "But it wasn't an animal either, not like any animal I've ever seen. The way it moved, yeah, too fast. And that jump." We finally forced ourselves back into the tent, zipping it up as if that thin layer of fabric could protect us from whatever was out there. We sat facing each other, flashlights on, listening intently for any sound of it returning. "Its eyes," I said suddenly, remembering. "Did you see its eyes?" Lucas nodded. They reflected the light, greenish-yellow like a cat's, but different. "And its face," I tried to find the words. "Its nose was flat, almost pushed in, and the hair didn't look like fur. It was stiffer, almost like I don't know how to describe it. Like bristles," Lucas said. "Like really coarse human hair." We sat in silence for a while, processing what we'd seen. Neither of us wanted to say the word that was hanging in the air between us. It seemed too ridiculous, too cliché, especially given where we were camping. Finally, Lucas said it. "So, we just saw a Sasquatch in Sasquatch Provincial Park." It should have been funny. Under any other circumstances, it would have been hilarious. But sitting there in that tent, with the memory of that thing still fresh in my mind, it wasn't funny at all. "Maybe it was a bear," I suggested weakly, "standing on its hind legs." "Bears don't run like that," Lucas said. "And they don't jump over stumps. And they definitely don't stand perfectly still, staring at you like it knew exactly what we were." He was right. Whatever we had seen, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't any animal I was familiar with, and it definitely wasn't human. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We sat in that tent, flashlights on, jumping at every sound. As soon as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, we packed up our stuff and got the hell out of there. We didn't even bother with breakfast, just threw everything into the car and drove straight back to town. On the drive back, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone playing a prank. Maybe it was sleep deprivation or our eyes playing tricks on us in the dark. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. And it wasn't human. We made a pact not to tell anyone. Who would believe us? We'd sound like a couple of drunk college kids making up stories. Or worse, people might believe us, and we'd become those Sasquatch guys for the rest of our lives. So we kept it to ourselves. For 38 years, we've kept it to ourselves. Lucas and I are still friends. We don't talk about that night much, but every now and then, one of us will bring it up. "Remember Deer Lake?" And the other will just nod. We don't need to say more than that. I still go camping occasionally, but never alone, never without a heavy-duty flashlight, and never, ever in Sasquatch Provincial Park. Some things you only need to see once in your lifetime. What bothers me most, even after all these years, isn't just what we saw. It's the questions that I can't answer. Was it watching us sleep? Had it been following us during the day? What would have happened if we hadn't woken up when we did? And the question that keeps me up some nights, how many other people have seen what we saw and, like us, been too afraid of ridicule to tell anyone about it? I don't know what we encountered that night. I just know that it changed how I see the world. There are things out there in the dark that don't fit into our neat categories of what's supposed to exist. Things that move too fast, jump too high, and watch us with eyes that reflect greenish yellow in a flashlight beam. I'm 58 years old now. I've got kids, a mortgage, a normal life. Most days I don't think about what happened at Deer Lake, but sometimes when I'm in the woods, or even just taking out the trash on a dark night, I'll get this feeling of being watched. And I'll remember those eyes, that silhouette, that impossible movement, and I'll hurry back inside, lock the door, and tell myself that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 14. Maigu. I still can't fully process what I saw that day in early July 1986. I've always been a rational person, not the type to believe in monsters or make up stories for attention. Before that day, I would have laughed if someone told me a story like the one I'm about to share. But now, I can't stop thinking about it, even after all these years. I live near Colmont, British Columbia. Small town. Everyone knows everyone, that sort of place. I've spent my whole life exploring the woods around here. I know every trail, every creek, every abandoned structure within miles. At least I thought I did. It was a warm day, probably around 70 degrees. The sky was clear, and I decided to take a walk to the creek to cool off. I'd taken this path hundreds of times before. Nothing special about it. The trail winds through a patch of forest before opening up near an old abandoned cabin that's been there since before I was born. Nobody really knows who built it or who it belonged to. It's just always been there, slowly falling apart. I was walking along, just enjoying the day, when something caught my eye. There was something on the roof of that cabin, about 100 feet away from where I was standing. At first glance, I thought it was a cinnamon bear. We get them around here sometimes. Light brown fur, decent size. Nothing that would normally make me nervous. I've had plenty of bear encounters over the years, and I know how to handle myself. But then it moved, and my blood went cold. The thing stood up, and I immediately knew it wasn't a bear. It was on the far side of the roof, so I couldn't see its legs below the knee, but what I could see was enough to make me freeze in place. It was big, maybe 7 feet tall, if I had to guess, though it was hard to tell with its lower half obscured by the roof edge. The body was covered in light brown hair, similar to that cinnamon color I mentioned, but the face was different. It had less hair there, a dark blackish-brown skin tone that looked wrong somehow. Its mouth was large and closed tight. That's something that stood out to me, how tightly closed that mouth was, like it was deliberately keeping it shut. And its nose, well, there wasn't one. Not really, just 2 holes where nostrils should be. Its head came to a slight point at the top, not like a human head at all. The worst part, the detail that makes people think I'm making this up when I tell them, was that it had breasts, long, droopy ones covered in the same light brown hair as the rest of its body. They hung down to about where its stomach would be. That's how I knew it was female. Or at least, that's what my brain told me in that moment of terror. Its arms weren't super long like you'd expect from an ape or something. They were proportioned more like a human's, but way more muscular. Its hands hung around knee level, not below the knees like you'd see with a gorilla. The whole thing looked like some horrible middle ground between human and something else. I stood there, completely frozen. Time seemed to slow down. I'm guessing I watched it for maybe 5 to 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't yell, couldn't do anything but stare. Then, without any warning, it jumped off the roof, just leaped right off and disappeared behind the cabin. The sound it made when it landed was heavy, a solid thud, followed by the cracking of twigs. Then I heard it running, crashing through the underbrush as it headed into the woods. That sound finally broke me out of my frozen state. I should have run away. Any reasonable person would have gotten the hell out of there. But for some stupid reason, curiosity overcame my fear. I had to know if what I'd seen was real. I approached the cabin slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around. The cabin looked the same as it always had. Weathered grey wood, missing shingles, broken windows. Nothing out of the ordinary except for the fact that something definitely not ordinary had been perched on its roof moments before. When I got to the back, I looked for footprints, but the ground was too hard and dry. There was just some broken vegetation where it had run off into the woods. I stood there for a while, staring into the trees, straining my ears for any sound that might tell me where it went. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of birds and wind through the leaves. It was as if the creature had never been there at all. I wanted to follow it. I really did. But something deep inside me, some primal instinct for self-preservation, kept me from going into those trees. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where it had disappeared, and then turned and walked home as fast as I could without actually running. When I got home, I was shaking. My wife asked what was wrong, and I couldn't even explain it properly. How do you tell someone you saw something that shouldn't exist? That you saw what looked like some kind of... I don't even know what to call it. Not Bigfoot. This wasn't like the descriptions I've heard. This was something else entirely. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. That hairless, blackish-brown face with the tight mouth and those nostril holes. I kept thinking about those droopy, hairy breasts and how unnatural they looked. And the way it moved, fluid but powerful, like it was perfectly comfortable on that roof. For days afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go back to that trail. I made excuses, took different routes, anything to avoid seeing that cabin again. But the image of that creature haunted me. I needed to know if it was still around, if it had made that area its home. About a week later, I finally worked up the courage to go back. I brought my rifle this time, though I'm not sure what good it would have done. I approached the cabin cautiously, checking the roof first thing. Nothing there. I circled the entire structure, looking for any sign that the creature had returned. There was nothing. No footprints, no tufts of hair, no evidence at all. I was almost convinced I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe the heat had gotten to me that day, or maybe I'd been more tired than I thought. But then my cousin Henry came to visit on July 26th. He'd planned to do some fishing in the creek, and I warned him to be careful near the old cabin, though I didn't tell him why. I didn't want him thinking I was crazy. When he came back that evening, his face was white as a sheet. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he started telling me about something he'd seen near the cabin. A creature on the roof, light brown, not a bear. His description matched what I'd seen exactly. The pointed head, the nostril holes instead of a nose, the hairy breasts. He'd only seen it for a few seconds before it disappeared into the woods, just like my experience. I finally told him about what I'd seen earlier that month. We stayed up late that night trying to make sense of it all. What was this thing? Why was it hanging around that old cabin? Was it living there? Was it just passing through? We had no answers, just more questions. The next day we went back together, armed and ready for, well, I don't know what. We searched the area thoroughly, even going inside the cabin for the first time in years. The place was empty. Dusty floors, broken furniture, nothing that indicated anything had been living there. We explored the surrounding woods for hours, but found nothing unusual. Over the next few weeks, we went back several times, sometimes together, sometimes alone. We never saw the creature again. Eventually, we stopped looking. Life went on, and the memory of what we'd seen began to fade a bit, though it never completely left me. I've told this story to a few people over the years. Most think I'm making it up or that I saw a bear and my imagination filled in the rest, but Henry and I know what we saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person in a costume, and it wasn't our imagination. Sometimes I still go by that cabin when I'm feeling brave, half hoping to see the creature again, just to prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But it's never reappeared. Whatever it was, some undiscovered species, some genetic anomaly, or something else entirely, it seems to have moved on from our little corner of British Columbia. But I know what I saw that day, and sometimes, when I'm walking in the woods and hear a twig snap behind me, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting. The thought makes me walk a little faster every time. What haunts me most isn't just the memory of what I saw, but the realization that there are things in this world we don't understand, things that exist in the shadows, just beyond our awareness. I used to think I knew these woods like the back of my hand. Now I know better. Now I know that no matter how familiar you think a place is, there's always something unknown waiting to be discovered. Sometimes that something has a blackish-brown face with no nose and hairy, drooping breasts, and sometimes it's watching you from the roof of an abandoned cabin in the woods. Story 15. I've never been one for telling tall tales. Ask anyone who knows me, Bobby Harris doesn't exaggerate. I'm 72 years old now, been fishing most of my life, and what happened back in August of '86 still gives me the willies. I've kept quiet about it for years because people look at you funny when you mention something like this, but I figure I'm too old now to care what folks think. My wife Kathy and I were on our annual summer camping trip up near Chilliwack. We'd been going there for years. Nice quiet spot along the Chilliwack River where the fishing is decent and the crowds are thin. We had our little camper set up in a spot with some privacy, not too far from the water, but with enough trees around to feel like you're really out in nature. That morning started like any other. Weather was perfect, not too hot yet, maybe mid-70s with a light breeze. I remember the sky was that crystal clear blue you only seem to get in the mountains. We'd gotten up early, had our coffee and some bacon and eggs cooked on our little portable stove. I remember joking with Kathy about how everything tastes better outdoors, even instant coffee. We gathered our gear and headed down to the river around 7 a.m. The spot we liked was about 100 yards from our camper, a nice wide bend in the river where I'd had luck in previous years. The water was running clear and cool, just deep enough to hold some decent-sized trout. I could hear the gentle gurgle of the current and the occasional splash of a jumping fish. Fishing was good that morning. Really good. I'd caught about 8 nice ones in just a couple hours, rainbow trout mostly, a couple pushing 16 inches. Around mid-morning, maybe 10:30 or so, I decided to string them up and hang them on a tree near our camper instead of keeping them on the stringer in the water. The day was warming up, and I didn't want them sitting in the sun. I remember walking back to the camper, carrying my catch, feeling pretty pleased with myself. There was this young pine about 15 feet from our camper, perfect for hanging fish. High enough to keep them out of reach of any smaller critters, but convenient enough that I could grab them later to clean. I strung them up about 6 feet off the ground, made sure they were secure, and headed back to the river. Kathy was still sitting in her folding chair, her line in the water, wearing that faded blue baseball cap she always wore fishing. I remember thinking how peaceful she looked there against the backdrop of the river and forest. I grabbed my rod, baited up, and was just about to cast when I heard Kathy make this strange noise. Not quite a scream, more like a gasp mixed with a "oh." I turned to look at her and saw her frozen in place, her eyes wide, staring past me toward our campsite. She was pointing, her hand shaking. "Bobby," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Look." I turned around, following her gaze, and that's when I saw it. I swear my heart stopped for a second. Standing by that young pine tree, reaching up for our fish, was something I still can't fully explain. It was tall. I'm 5'10", and this thing was at least 7 feet, maybe more, covered in dark grey hair all over its body. Not fur like a bear, but hair, longer, shaggier. It was standing on 2 legs, completely upright, reaching up with arms that seemed too long for its body. The thing had its back to us mostly, but I could see its profile a bit. The head sat directly on massive shoulders, not much of a neck that I could see. It moved deliberately, not rushing, almost casual as it reached up and grabbed our string of fish. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. I just stood there, fishing rod still in my hand, watching this creature take our fish off the tree as easy as you'd pick an apple. What struck me was how purposeful it was. It didn't look around nervously or act like it was stealing. It just took the fish and then turned away from the tree. That's when I got a better look at it. The face was, well, not human, but not like any animal I'd ever seen either. Flat, broad nose, deep-set eyes under a prominent brow. Its jaw was massive. The creature just casually walked away, fish in hand, moving through the bush toward the nearby road. It crossed the gravel road in maybe 3 or 4 strides and disappeared into the forest on the other side. The whole thing couldn't have taken more than 30 seconds. For what felt like forever, Kathy and I just stood there, completely silent. The only sound was the river rushing behind us and the distant call of a bird. It was like the world had momentarily stopped making sense, and we were waiting for reality to reassert itself. Finally, Kathy broke the silence. "What in the heck was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. I found my voice, though it didn't sound like my own when I spoke. "That was a Bigfoot," I said slowly, "and I still don't believe it." I remember how strange those words felt coming out of my mouth. I'd always scoffed at Bigfoot stories, always thought they were tall tales told by attention seekers or folks who'd had too much to drink. Yet here I was, saying the word out loud, because nothing else fit what we'd just seen. We stood there for another minute or two, both of us afraid to move, like we might break some spell. Finally, I put down my rod and said, "We better go check the campsite." Walking back to our camper felt surreal. My legs were unsteady, and I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see the creature watching us. The fish were gone, of course. The string had been taken too. There was no sign of struggle or mess, just our empty campsite, looking completely normal, as if nothing unusual had happened. That's when we noticed a couple approaching us from another campsite, maybe 100 yards away. Middle-aged man and woman, both looking as shaken as we felt. The man called out before they even reached us. "Did you folks just see that thing?" he asked, his voice low, like he was afraid of being overheard. Kathy and I just nodded. The 4 of us stood there in a small circle, all struggling to find words. "It took our fish," I finally said, pointing to the tree. "We saw it from our sight," the woman said. "At first I thought it was a bear standing up, but—" "No bear moves like that," her husband finished. "No bear walks across a road on 2 legs like it's the most natural thing in the world." We introduced ourselves, though I don't recall their names now. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, comparing what we'd seen, assuring each other we weren't crazy. They'd seen it from a different angle, but described the same thing: the height, the greyish hair, the casual way it took the fish and walked off. The strange thing was, none of us felt afraid enough to pack up and leave. Shocked, yes. Rattled, absolutely. But not in danger. The creature had shown no aggression, hadn't even acknowledged our presence. It had simply taken the fish and left. After the couple went back to their site, Kathy and I discussed what to do. Part of me wanted to report it to someone, but who? The park ranger would probably think we were nuts, the police, and say what? Someone stole our fish. In the end, we decided to stay. We'd planned to be there 2 more days, and damn it, we weren't going to let this thing, whatever it was, ruin our vacation. That night was tense, though. We sat close to our campfire, talking in low voices, straining to hear any unusual sounds from the forest. I kept my old hunting knife close at hand, though I'm not sure what good it would have done against something that size. We barely slept, both of us jolting awake at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves outside. The next morning I went fishing again, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I needed to replace the fish we'd lost. I caught another good string of trout, but this time I cleaned them right away and stored them in our cooler inside the camper. That afternoon, a man showed up at our campsite, introducing himself as Thomas Steenberg. Said he was a researcher of some kind, heard about our sighting from someone at the campground office. At first I was hesitant to talk to him, figuring he was either going to ridicule us or sensationalize what happened. But he seemed genuinely interested and respectful, asking detailed questions without pushing or leading us. We told him everything we could remember, and he took notes, occasionally nodding like what we were saying lined up with things he'd heard before. He asked if he could look around the area, particularly across the road where the creature had disappeared. I offered to show him, but he said he preferred to check it out alone, methodically. Something about not wanting to contaminate the site with too many footprints. He seemed to know what he was doing, so we let him go. We were packing up to head home when he returned a couple hours later, looking excited but trying to contain it. He told us he'd found footprints, a whole line of them following a creek that fed into the river. Said they were huge, some nearly 18 inches long. He'd followed them through a grassy clearing before they disappeared at a rocky area. Said he counted over 100 distinct footprint impressions, took photos, and even made some plaster casts of the best ones. I asked to see the photos, and when he showed me, a chill ran up my spine. There, in the soft mud by the creek, was a footprint that looked vaguely human, but was too large, too wide, with a different arch. 5 toes, clearly defined. It matched the size of the creature we'd seen. Kathy and I left that afternoon as planned. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. We talked about it off and on in the days that followed, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. Steinberg called us once about a week later, asking a few follow-up questions, but we never heard from him again. Over the years, the memory has remained vivid. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was a man in a suit or a bear that somehow looked different from the angle we saw it. But I know better. You don't mistake something like that. You don't forget the way it moved, so fluid and natural, yet so unlike anything human. Kathy and I went back to that same campground the next summer, partly out of tradition and partly, I think, hoping for some kind of confirmation that would help us make sense of what we'd seen. But everything was normal. The fishing was good, the weather was fine, and nothing unusual happened. That's the thing that still gets me after all these years. Life just went on. The world didn't change. The sun still rose the next day, but I know what I saw standing by that tree, taking our fish. I know it was real, and sometimes, when I'm out in the woods and hear a branch crack in the distance, I can't help but wonder if it's out there, watching and waiting for another opportunity to snatch an easy meal from unsuspecting campers. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I still don't believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and no matter how many years pass, I'll never forget that moment when our eyes met, just for a second, before it turned and walked away. In that brief moment, I didn't see an animal. I saw intelligence, recognition, and that, more than anything else, is what still keeps me up at night sometimes.